The black heavy utility vehicle devoured the empty stretches of the Wyoming highway, like a mechanical beast hunting in the dead of afternoon. Inside the steel belly of the machine, the air was stagnant and thick with the chemical smell of synthetic leather and cold medicinal dread. 6-year-old Maya Sterling sat pressed hard against the passenger side door. Her small, fragile body was curled into a tight, defensive ball. Her bare feet were tucked beneath the ragged hem of her torn summer dress. Dark crusts of dried blood flaked along the soles of her feet. The blood was a testament to her desperate sprint across sharp gravel 2 stops ago. She had almost made it to the rusted door of a gas station bathroom before the man had caught her arm. He had squeezed her fragile bones until the pain forced the screams to die in her throat. That was 47 hours ago, or perhaps it was 50. Maya had lost track of the sunrises and sunsets. The world outside the tinted glass had become an endless blur of green pines and gray asphalt. She kept her wide, unblinking eyes fixed on the passenger window. She watched the jagged, unforgiving landscape of the American West roll past. Massive mountains rose in the far distance like ancient sleeping giants. Their rocky peaks were still dusted with the pale white snow of late spring. Her grandmother used to sit her on her lap and tell her old stories about those very mountains. She spoke of the hard people who lived in their deep shadows. Tough people, scary-looking people. Grandma always told her never to judge a book by its cover. She said sometimes the monsters you are running from are wearing expensive suits and perfect smiles. And sometimes the guardian angels sent to protect you have dark tattoos and ride loud motorcycles. Maya did not understand what those words meant back then. She was only 6. But sitting in the cold leather seat of the moving prison, she was starting to understand exactly what her grandmother meant. The man driving the beast of a vehicle was named Hollis Thorne. He had introduced himself on that first terrible day. He had offered her a piece of colorful candy near the swings at her local park. He had seemed so incredibly nice at first glance. He had a clean-shaven jawline. His hair was perfectly combed. He wore an expensive silver watch on his left wrist. He possessed the exact kind of practiced warm smile that made grown adults trust him without a second thought. He told her he was a close friend of her father. He said there had been a terrible emergency at the construction site. He said her father had asked him to pick her up and bring her to the hospital. Maya had known immediately that it was a lie. Her father never sent strangers. Her father always picked her up himself, even when he was exhausted from working double shifts framing houses. Her real father smelled like fresh-cut cedar wood and dark roasted coffee and the sweet peppermint gum he always chewed to keep himself awake. This strange man driving the car smelled completely wrong. He smelled like sterile hospital corridors and a sickeningly sweet cologne that made the back of her throat burn. Before she could turn and run away across the playground grass, he had moved with terrifying speed. Hollis had pressed a damp, coarse cloth over her nose and mouth. The world had instantly turned fuzzy and gray and then entirely black. When Maya finally woke up, she was no longer in the park. She was trapped in the back of this massive black vehicle. The comfortable rear passenger seats had been completely removed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. In their place lay a thin, stained mattress. Heavy metal rings were bolted directly into the steel floorboards. She had seen the thick plastic zip ties scattered in the corner. She had seen the silver rolls of heavy-duty duct tape. She had seen the red plastic cooler filled with sugary juice boxes and small white unmarked pills. Hollis called those pills sleepy candy. He had tried to force her to swallow one of those bitter pills on the first day. After that terrifying experience, Maya had learned how to survive. She learned to pretend to swallow the medication. She would hide the chalky white pill deep under her tongue until he turned his attention back to the highway. Then she would quietly spit it into the palm of her hand and drop it into the dark crevices of the floor. She knew she needed to stay awake. She needed to keep her mind sharp. She needed to remember every single detail because Maya Sterling was a fighter and she refused to simply disappear into the dark. The heavy vehicle began to slow down. They were approaching a very small remote town tucked quietly into the base of the looming mountains. Maya could see a flickering neon sign buzzing in the bright afternoon sun. It was an isolated gas station. Her small heart began to pound against her ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. She knew this might be her only chance. She spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She told the man she needed to use the bathroom. Hollis shifted his gaze and looked at her through the rearview mirror. His eyes were cold and dead and calculating. They looked absolutely nothing like the warm, friendly eyes he had faked at the park. He told her she had just gone an hour ago. She insisted that her stomach hurt, and she needed to go again. It was not a total lie. Her stomach had been cramping violently for 2 days from pure blinding fear and the few stale crackers he had allowed her to eat. But mostly Maya just needed him to stop the moving cage. She needed the wheels to stop turning. Hollis let out a long, irritated sigh and yanked the steering wheel to the right. The heavy tires crunched loudly over the loose gravel as he pulled the vehicle to a halt beside a rusted fueling pump. He unlocked the heavy doors and turned to look at her. He told her she had exactly 2 minutes. His voice dropped an octave, becoming a sharp blade of a threat. He warned her that if she tried to run away again, he would force her to eat handfuls of the sleepy candy. He said he would give her enough to keep her quiet for a very long time. He demanded to know if she understood his warning. Maya simply nodded her head. Her small chin trembled with genuine fear. But deep inside her chest, beneath the terror, something hard and fierce was building. A primal survival instinct as old as the mountains surrounding them. She climbed out of the tall vehicle. Her thin legs shook violently beneath her. The afternoon air hit her face. It was cool and incredibly clean. The wind carried the rich scent of pine needles and damp earth and distant rain. Maya breathed the fresh air in as deeply as she could. She filled her burning lungs with the taste of freedom while it was still available. Hollis grabbed her thin wrist. His large hand clamped around her bones like an iron vise. He marched her roughly toward the concrete block building that housed the restrooms. He pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside first. He visually inspected every corner of the small, dirty room to ensure there were no windows and no secondary exits. Satisfied that it was a solid concrete trap, he pulled her inside and pushed her toward the toilet. He stepped back out into the heat. He told her again she had 2 minutes and pulled the door shut. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place, locking her inside. Maya stood entirely alone in the cramped, filthy space. The fluorescent light bulb above her head buzzed with a loud electric hum. It cast a sickly, pale yellow glow over the stained sink and the cracked mirror. She looked up. There was a single small window near the very top of the concrete wall. It had been painted shut decades ago and was covered in a thick layer of oily grime. It was far too high for her to ever reach, even if she stacked the garbage can on the toilet. But then she looked down. Near the wet concrete floor, hidden behind the plumbing of the sink, was a metal ventilation grate. It was partially rusted through and covered in dark dust. It was incredibly narrow, but just wide enough for a very small, determined body to squeeze inside. Maya did not hesitate. She dropped heavily to her bare knees. She dug her weak, trembling fingers into the gaps of the rusted metal. Her body was exhausted from starvation and lack of sleep, but the pure adrenaline of terror granted her a sudden burst of frantic strength. The screws holding the vent in place were old and loose. They had probably not been tightened since the building was constructed. She pulled with all her might. The metal grate tore free from the wall with a loud metallic screech that echoed horribly in the small tiled room. Maya froze completely still. She stopped breathing. She waited for the sound of heavy boots kicking the door open. She waited for Hollis to grab her by the hair. But nothing happened. Only the hum of the light bulb filled the silence. She peered into the dark rectangular hole. The ventilation shaft was pitch black and incredibly narrow. The jagged edges of rusted metal pointed inward like broken teeth. She had absolutely no idea where the dark tunnel led. It might lead to the outside alleyway. It might lead to a locked storage closet. It might lead to a dead end where she would become hopelessly wedged and trapped until he dragged her out by her feet. But staying in the bathroom meant certain death. Maya was smart enough to know that. She had listened closely to the phone calls Hollis made while driving. She had heard him tell another man that the package was secured. She heard him confirm that the buyer was ready and waiting. She heard him demand full payment upon delivery. She knew she was the package. She knew she was being delivered to a place she would never return from. She flattened her small body against the cold floor and squeezed her head and shoulders into the dark vent. The rusted metal was freezing against her bare arms. The jagged edges immediately sliced thin cuts into her pale skin. The darkness inside the shaft was absolute and terrifying. It pressed against her wide-open eyes like a heavy physical weight. Maya had always been terrified of the dark. She used to sleep with a bright pink nightlight plugged into the wall next to her bed. But the real monsters did not live in the dark shadows of a bedroom. The real monsters drove black SUVs and smiled politely at strangers. She kept crawling. She dragged her body forward inch by painful inch. The metal shaft twisted to the right and became even narrower. She had to exhale all the air from her lungs just to force her rib cage past a tight bend. The fabric of her torn summer dress caught on a sharp piece of iron and ripped further up her side. She did not stop moving. Soon she began to hear new sounds echoing through the thin metal walls. She heard the muffled clatter of falling tools and the low hum of a large commercial refrigerator. She reached the end of the dark tunnel, her small hands pressed against another metal grate. She pushed forward with her head and shoulders. The grate gave way easily and tumbled outward, hitting a concrete floor with a loud clatter. Maya tumbled out of the shaft head first. She landed hard on her shoulder, gasping for breath and trembling violently. She was covered from head to toe in dark rust dust and fresh blood from a dozen tiny cuts. She scrambled quickly to her feet and scanned her new surroundings. She was standing in a messy storage room filled with stacked boxes of motor oil and cleaning supplies. To her left was a heavy metal door slightly ajar. Bright, blinding afternoon sunlight spilled through the crack. She ran. She did not look back to see if anyone was in the storage room. She burst through the heavy metal door and exploded into the heat of the day. She was behind the gas station facing a dense line of thick pine trees and scrub brush. Far down the road, she could see the majestic peaks of the mountains. She ran toward the tree line and with everything she had left. Her bare feet slammed against the sharp gravel and broken glass littering the back lot. Searing jolts of pain shot up her legs with every single footstep. Fresh blood smeared across the rocks, leaving a clear trail behind her, but Maya completely ignored the pain. She blocked out the burning in her lungs. The only thing that mattered in the entire world was putting distance between her fragile body and the monster waiting by the bathroom door. Suddenly, a voice cut through the quiet afternoon air. It was smooth and perfectly controlled. It was pitched loud enough to carry, but calm enough not to alert anyone driving by on the highway. Maya, sweetie, please come back here right now. It was Hollis. He had realized the bathroom was empty. He was standing at the corner of the building scanning the tree line. He sounded like a concerned parent looking for a lost child. He told her she was confused and that he was only trying to help her find her father. Maya did not turn her head. Her grandmother had always warned her that looking back was exactly how people got caught. You have to keep your eyes focused entirely on where you are going and never on where you have been. She reached the edge of the dense forest and plunged headfirst into the thick brush. The vegetation was incredibly dense and covered in sharp thorns. It whipped violently against her face and bare arms. It tore fresh wounds into her skin, but it also provided thick visual cover. The heavy utility vehicle could never follow her into these woods, but the man driving it certainly could. She heard the distant, heavy slam of a car door. She heard the loud crunch of heavy boots running across the gravel lot. She heard the violent rustling of branches breaking as a large man pushed his way into the forest behind her. The voice changed now. The fake warmth was completely gone. The tone became cold and flat and dripping with dark promises. He told her she was making things very difficult for him. He warned her that the buyers did not like to pay for damaged goods. He told her that if she made him chase her any further, he would make sure she regretted it for the rest of her short life. Maya kept pushing forward through the pain. Her lungs felt like they were filled with burning acid. Her leg muscles screamed and trembled, demanding she collapse into the dirt. She was only 6 years old. She was starved and dehydrated and terrified. Her physical body was rapidly shutting down, but her spirit flatly refused to surrender. She broke through a thick wall of pine branches and suddenly stumbled onto a wide clearing. She stopped breathing for a second. Hidden deep in the woods, set back from a winding, two-lane blacktop road, stood a long, low wooden building. It looked old and weathered. The gravel parking lot in front of the structure was massive, and lined up in perfect gleaming rows across the front of the building were motorcycles. There were dozens of them, massive machines built of heavy American steel and polished chrome. They sat silently in the afternoon sun like a pack of sleeping mechanical wolves waiting for a command. Maya stared at the metal machines. The words of her grandmother echoed loudly in the back of her mind. Sometimes the angels sent to protect you have dark tattoos and ride loud motorcycles. Maya did not know if those words were actually true. She did not know if the rough men inside that old wooden building would protect her, or if they would simply grab her by the arm and drag her right back to Hollis. She did not know anything at all about the world of outlaws and bikers, but she knew that the heavy footsteps crashing through the brush behind her were getting closer. She knew her legs could not carry her another 100 yards. She had absolutely no other choice left. She sprinted across the open gravel lot. She ran straight toward the heavy wooden double doors of the building. Above the entrance was a faded hand-painted sign featuring a winged skull and the words "The Iron Sanctuary." It was a clear visual warning to regular citizens to stay far away. Keep out, danger ahead. Maya ignored the warning. She threw her small body weight against the heavy wooden door. She burst through the entrance with enough frantic momentum to crack the old wood of the doorframe. The loud noise echoed like a gunshot. The entire interior of the iron sanctuary fell completely dead silent. Every single deep conversation ceased instantly. The clinking of beer bottles stopped. The low rumble of the jukebox seemed to fade away. Every head in the dimly lit room slowly turned to face the entrance. Inside the sprawling tavern sat over a dozen massive men. They were scattered around the scarred wooden tables and a long mahogany bar. They all wore heavy black leather vests adorned with intricate patches and rockers. They were enormous men. They had thick, unkempt beards and arms covered entirely in dark, swirling tattoos. Their faces were weathered and scarred from decades of hard living and violence. Their eyes were cold and hard. They were the exact kind of men that mothers instinctively crossed the street to avoid. They were outlaws. And standing in the center of the doorway, completely framed by the bright afternoon sunlight, was Maya Sterling. She stood barefoot on the beer-stained hardwood floor. Her small frame was violently trembling. Her ripped summer dress hung loosely off one pale shoulder. Her face was streaked heavily with dark dirt and dried tears and fresh, bright red blood. She weighed perhaps 40 pounds soaking wet. She was a tiny, broken, fragile figure standing in a den of hardened wolves. Behind her through the slowly swinging wooden doors, the men in the room could see a man burst from the tree line and step onto the gravel parking lot, looking furiously toward the building. Maya did not cower away from the intimidating men staring at her. She did not drop to her knees and weep uncontrollably. She had spent the last 2 days being paralyzed by fear. That fear had finally burned itself out and left a core of pure steel in its place. She stood as tall as her tiny frame allowed. She straightened her spine. She locked her wide eyes directly onto the largest, most terrifying-looking man sitting at the center table. She spoke in a voice that was remarkably clear and completely steady. She told the room that a bad man was outside right now. She stated clearly that he had taken her from the park 2 days ago against her will. She explained that she had escaped through a vent when he stopped to get Gim. She looked the giant man dead in the eyes and said she needed help immediately. For a long, tense moment, nobody in the bar moved a single muscle. The man she had spoken directly to sat perfectly still. His name was Gideon Vane. Most men simply called him Nash. He was the sitting president of the Black Guardians Motorcycle Club. He was 58 years old, but his eyes held the weary weight of a man who had lived for centuries. He was a combat veteran who had seen the worst of humanity in foreign deserts. His thick silver hair was pulled back tightly. His eyes were the color of cold forged steel. 20 long agonizing years ago, Gideon had a daughter named Meredith. She was beautiful and full of life. One sunny afternoon, 14-year-old Meredith had walked to a friend's house just 3 blocks away from their family home. She had never made it. She never came back. The police had found her broken body a week later, discarded in a shallow ditch like unwanted garbage. Gideon had spent the last 2 decades waking up every single morning, suffocating, under the crushing weight of that grief. He had channeled all his dark rage and endless sorrow into building this motorcycle club. He built a brotherhood of outlaws to replace the family he had lost. His entire life had become an endless march of penance for failing to protect his only child. He had seen a lot of crazy things walk through the doors of the Iron Sanctuary over the years. He had seen drunk cowboys looking for brawls. He had seen undercover cops trying to build federal cases. He had seen rival gang members holding weapons. He had dealt with all of them using brutal efficiency. But he had never seen anything like this. He had never seen a battered, bleeding 6-year-old girl stand perfectly straight like a seasoned soldier and demand sanctuary from a room full of killers. Before Gideon could formulate a response, the heavy wooden doors swung open wide. Hollis Thorne stepped confidently into the dim light of the tavern. He had quickly brushed the dirt from his expensive pressed khakis. He adjusted the collar of his pristine polo shirt. He plastered the perfect, warm, apologetic smile across his face. Everything about his physical presentation was carefully engineered to project total respectability and calm authority. He looked like a wealthy suburban father who had simply lost track of his mischievous child. He let out a loud theatrical sigh of relief and shook his head while looking at the men at the bar. He apologized profusely to the gentleman in the room for the sudden disturbance. He pointed at Maya and claimed she had an incredibly wild imagination. He said they had been playing an intense game of hide and seek, and that she had taken the rules a little too seriously and run off. He took a slow, confident step toward the little girl. Maya let out a scream that shook the dust from the ceiling rafters. It was not the high-pitched tantrum of a spoiled child who wanted a toy. It was the soul-tearing sound of pure primal terror. It was the horrific sound of helpless prey, recognizing the predator that was about to consume it. It was a sound that instantly bypassed the logical brain and struck directly at the core of human instinct. Maya scrambled frantically backward away from the reaching hands of Hollis. Her bloody bare feet slipped wildly on the slick, hardwood floor. She backpedaled until her small back crashed hard against the heavy leather-clad legs of Gideon Vane. Without a second thought, she reached down and grabbed fistfuls of his thick denim jeans. She curled her body behind his massive frame, making herself as small as physically possible. She began to speak in a rapid, desperate whisper that carried clearly across the silent room. She told the giant biker that the man at the door was not her father. She stated proudly that her real father's name was David Sterling and that he built houses with his hands. She pointed out that her real father had a thick white scar across the back of his hand from a circular saw accident. She told the room her real father smelled like fresh-cut cedar and peppermint gum. She begged the giant man blocking her not to let the stranger take her away. The atmosphere inside the tavern shifted violently. The air grew instantly thick and heavy with dark, suffocating tension. 12 hardened outlaws, most of whom had daughters or granddaughters of their own, felt a deep biological switch flip inside their chests. The powerful protective instinct that slumbers in the heart of every true warrior woke up and roared to life. The men did not draw weapons or shout. They simply sat up straighter. Their hands slowly dropped beneath the tables. Their eyes locked onto the man standing in the doorway with the cold, calculating stare of a firing squad. Gideon Vane did not stand up immediately. He slowly lowered his massive scarred hand and placed it gently on Maya's trembling shoulder. The physical contact was incredibly gentle, but the weight of his hand was a silent, ironclad promise. He rumbled in a voice deep enough to vibrate the floorboards. He told the little girl to stay exactly where she was, right behind him. Hollis maintained his polite smile, but a microscopic flicker of genuine concern flashed behind his eyes. He was a professional predator, and he was rapidly assessing the new variables in the room. He realized these men were not normal citizens, easily swayed by a nice shirt and a polite tone. He stepped forward again. He spoke in a very calm, reasonable voice. He told the bikers that he completely understood how concerning the situation appeared from the outside. He assured them it was merely a complex medical misunderstanding. He claimed his daughter suffered from severe behavioral issues and mental breaks. He said her expensive therapist noted that she created elaborate traumatic fantasies whenever she became emotionally upset. He politely stated that he just needed to take her back to her mother so they could give her proper medication. A voice cut through the room from the far end of the long mahogany bar. It belonged to a man built like a brick wall with tribal ink covering his thick neck. He asked the man in the polo shirt a very simple question. He asked him to state the name of his daughter. Hollis tightened his jaw slightly to maintain his pleasant expression. He answered smoothly without hesitation. He said her name was Maya. Behind Gideon's leg, the little girl violently flinched at the sound of her own name in the mouth of the monster. But she refused to remain silent. She knew silence meant death. She gathered her breath and spoke up so everyone could hear. She pointed a trembling finger at Hollis and called him a liar. She explained to the room of bikers that the man had not even known her real name when he first grabbed her at the park. She said he had only called her generic names like Sweetie and Honey for the entire first day in the car. She revealed that he only discovered her real name when he dug through her small backpack and found her kindergarten school folder. Gideon looked down at the man in the polo shirt. His stare was devoid of any human warmth. He waited for a response. Hollis realized the polite suburban father routine was rapidly failing. He decided to switch to righteous indignation. He reached his hand slowly into the back pocket of his khakis and retrieved a thick leather wallet. He flipped it open to reveal a stack of cards. He raised his voice and demanded respect. He stated firmly that he possessed full legal custody of the child. He claimed he had her official birth certificate and medical records locked inside the glove compartment of his vehicle. He declared that this was a private family matter and that the men in the room were illegally interfering with a father's right to discipline his child. Gideon finally pushed his chair back and stood up to his full, imposing height. He stood well over 6 feet tall and broad as a barn door. He stared down at Hollis and spoke in a low, terrifying rumble. He suggested that since Hollis had all the proper legal documentation, he would not mind waiting comfortably in the bar until the local county sheriff arrived to verify his claims. Hollis took a quick step backward toward the entrance. He realized he was trapped. The heavy wooden double doors he had walked through were now blocked. Two massive bikers had moved silently from their tables and now stood shoulder to shoulder blocking the exit. Hollis raised his voice in feigned anger. He called the situation ridiculous. He called the men a gang of violent criminals. He stated loudly that everyone in the county knew exactly what kind of illegal business their club ran. He warned them that holding him against his will was a federal kidnapping charge. A woman voice echoed from the dark hallway leading to the back offices. It was a smooth, calm voice dripping with dark amusement. The voice noted that kidnapping was a very ironic choice of words for him to use. Sloane Whitaker walked slowly into the dim light of the main bar. She was 32 years old and the only female patched member of the Black Guardians. She wore black boots and a leather jacket. Before she found her family with the bikers, she had been a highly cleared cryptography and data analysis expert for the military. She held an open, glowing laptop resting heavily on her left forearm. Her right hand tapped quickly on the keys. She did not look at Hollis. She looked directly at Gideon. She reported that she had just run the license plate numbers on the black utility vehicle parked outside. She confirmed the plates were stolen off a truck in Colorado 3 weeks ago. She then pulled up a facial recognition database program she maintained for club security. She stated that the face of the man standing in their bar was currently matching a high-priority internal law enforcement alert spanning across 3 different western states. Hollis Thorne felt the entire world collapse around him. The carefully constructed illusion of the respectable businessman shattered completely. He was no longer dealing with gullible parents or slow-moving local police. He was trapped in a box with men who lived outside the law and a woman who could see through digital walls. He looked at the bikers blocking the door. He looked at the giant moving toward him. He made a desperate, calculated decision. He lunged violently to his left toward a narrow side hallway that led to the kitchen. He moved with the surprising explosive speed of a man fighting for his absolute freedom. He knocked over a heavy wooden chair and sprinted for the dark corridor. He made it exactly 3 steps before the world went black. A younger biker named Jax, who had been sitting quietly near the jukebox, launched himself across the room like a guided missile. He hit Hollis perfectly around the waist with a brutal driving tackle. The sheer force of the impact lifted Hollis completely off his feet and drove his body through the air. They crashed violently into a heavy oak pool table. The thick wood cracked loudly under the impact. Hollis hit the hardwood floor face first with a sickening thud. The breath exploded from his lungs. Before Hollis could even attempt to recover or fight back, 3 more massive bikers descended upon him. Heavy leather boots pinned his arms to the floor. A thick knee pressed mercilessly into the back of his neck, holding his face flat against the beer-soaked wood. He was completely immobilized in a matter of seconds. During the violent struggle, the heavy leather wallet had fallen from the pocket of the khakis. It slid across the floor and popped open, spilling its contents across the wood. Sloane walked over calmly and crouched down. She began sifting through the scattered plastic cards with her fingers. Her face grew darker and more dangerous with every card she examined. She held up a laminated driver's license and read the name aloud. Richard Thompson from Nevada. She tossed it aside and picked up another. Michael Watts from Oregon. She picked up a third. Hollis Thorne from California. She looked down at the man pinned to the floor with an expression of pure physical disgust. She asked him quietly exactly how many fake lives he had running at once. But it was the other items that had tumbled out of the hidden compartments of the wallet that made the entire tavern go dead silent. A tight bundle of heavy-duty industrial zip ties, the kind police use during mass riots, a miniature roll of silver duct tape compressed flat, and a small amber plastic prescription bottle completely devoid of any medical labels. It was filled to the top with small, chalky white pills. Maya saw the bottle roll across the floor. She started crying again. Not tears of fear, but the overwhelming tears of a trauma survivor, forced to look at the instrument of their torture. She buried her dirty face deep into the heavy denim covering Gideon's leg. She pointed a shaking finger at the bottle. She sobbed and told the room that he had forced her to take one of those pills at the park. She said he called it candy, but it made her dizzy and sleepy, and when she woke up, she was locked in his car. Gideon Vane stared down at the white pills scattered on the floorboard. He felt a cold, ancient darkness wake up and uncoil inside his chest. It was the exact same crushing darkness he had felt standing in the freezing morgue 20 years ago, staring down at the lifeless face of his little girl. It was the violent urge to destroy the evil that preyed upon the innocent. He looked at Sloane. His voice was no longer a rumble. It was quiet and sharp and deadly as a razor blade. He ordered her to go outside and physically tear that vehicle apart. Sloane did not need to be told twice. She handed her laptop to Jax and marched out the front doors into the blinding afternoon sun. The doors of the black SUV were still unlocked. She pulled the rear passenger door open and peered inside the dark interior. What she saw inside that vehicle made the seasoned military veteran physically step back and brace her hands against her knees to take several deep, unsteady breaths. The visual reality of the evil was staggering. She walked slowly back into the tavern. Her face was entirely drained of color. Her eyes were widening and haunted. She walked directly to Gideon. She told him in a hollow voice that he needed to come outside and look at the car himself. Gideon looked down at the little girl clinging desperately to his leg. He gently peeled her fingers away and asked Sloane to stay right there and protect her. Sloane dropped to her knees and gathered the filthy, bleeding child into her arms, holding her tight. She murmured soft, gentle reassurances as Gideon turned and walked out into the heat. The bright Wyoming sun seemed entirely too cheerful for the darkness Gideon was about to witness. He walked to the open door of the vehicle and looked inside. The plush leather rear seats were completely gone. In their place lay the filthy, stained mattress. He saw the heavy metal D-rings drilled directly through the floorboards into the steel frame. He saw the thick nylon straps designed to secure a human body from thrashing. He saw the red cooler pushed into the corner. It was a mobile dungeon. It was a rolling cage specifically designed for the absolute subjugation of a child. But the hardware was not the worst part. Mounted securely to the center dashboard was an expensive smartphone. It was still unlocked. The screen was glowing brightly, displaying an encrypted messaging application. The application was open to a long-running thread of recent communications. Gideon leaned his massive frame into the front seat and read the glowing text messages. He felt his large, scarred hands begin to shake violently with a pure, unadulterated rage he had not allowed himself to feel in 2 decades. The messages were stark and businesslike. Package successfully acquired without incident. ETA to secondary transfer point is 6 hours. Buyer has confirmed receipt of profile. Full payment is expected on delivery to the hangar. Gideon scrolled down with a trembling finger. The next messages were worse. This specific package is absolutely perfect. Very young, extremely healthy. No underlying medical issues detected. We are demanding the premium price for this one. Gideon stared at the glowing digital words until his vision narrowed into a dark red tunnel of fury. Maya Sterling was not simply the victim of a random kidnapping by a deranged lone wolf. She was a piece of high-value merchandise. She was being transported to be sold for profit. Somewhere deep in the darkest corners of his memory, Gideon heard the voice of his daughter Meredith screaming for him in the dark. It was the phantom voice that haunted his sleep and poisoned his waking hours. It was the voice of a child begging for her father to come save her from the monsters. He had never been able to answer that call. He had arrived a week too late, but the little girl crying inside his bar was still breathing. Maya was still alive. She was here. She had fought tooth and nail for her freedom, and she had been brave enough to run straight into a den of outlaws to demand protection. He pulled his head out of the vehicle. He stood up straight and breathed in the hot, dry air. He turned around and walked back through the heavy wooden doors of the iron sanctuary. Every single step he took was heavy, deliberate, and completely controlled. The men in the room watched him enter. They saw the look on his face and they instinctively took a step back. Hollis Thorne was still pinned face down on the dirty floor. He was still struggling weakly against the heavy boots of the bikers. He was still arrogantly threatening them with massive civil lawsuits and federal prison time. He claimed he had powerful friends who would wipe their club off the face of the earth. Gideon slowly crouched down on one knee right next to the struggling man-face. He leaned in incredibly close. He spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but it carried the absolute finality of an executioner reading a sentence. He told Hollis exactly what was going to happen next. He explained calmly that the local authorities were already on their way. He told him that when the police arrived, they were going to fully search the black vehicle. He whispered that they were going to find the fake identification cards, the heavy restraints, the unmarked sedatives, and the encrypted messages detailing human trafficking. He promised the man that he was going to spend the rest of his miserable, pathetic life rotting away in a dark concrete cell surrounded by men who knew exactly what he did to little girls. The arrogant bravado of Hollis Thorne finally cracked completely like thin ice over deep black water. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him. He began to panic. He shifted his tone from threatening to desperate begging. He told Gideon that he did not understand the people he was dealing with. He pleaded with the biker to let him go. He promised that if they just let him walk out the back door, he could disappear completely, and no one would ever know. He started offering money. He offered $50,000 in untraceable cash. He offered $100,000. He screamed that he could get the money by tomorrow morning. Gideon let out a short, harsh laugh that held absolutely zero humor. It was a sound as cold and hard as the frost on a winter window. He asked the pathetic, bleeding man on the floor if he honestly believed they cared about his dirty money. He stood up slowly, towering over the prisoner. He looked down with an expression that went far beyond mere contempt. He looked at him like he was a diseased insect waiting to be crushed. He looked over at Jax and the other men holding him down. He ordered them to drag the piece of garbage into the soundproof back storage room. He told them to secure him tightly to a heavy chair and make absolutely certain he did not manage to hurt himself before the sheriff arrived to take him into custody. The massive bikers grabbed Hollis by his arms and legs. They lifted him off the floor like a rag doll. They dragged him kicking and screaming through the dark side hallway. His desperate, frantic pleading echoed loudly off the wooden walls until the heavy steel door of the storage room slammed shut, cutting off the sound completely. Gideon turned his attention back to the corner of the room. Sloane was still sitting on the floor, cradling Maya in her lap. The little girl had stopped sobbing. Her tear-streaked, filthy face peeked out from the protective leather jacket Sloane had wrapped around her small shoulders. Her ancient, intelligent eyes were fixed, unblinking on Gideon. He walked over slowly and knelt down until he was at eye level with the child. Up close, the physical toll of her ordeal was heartbreaking. He could clearly see the deep purple bruises forming on her arms where she had been violently grabbed. He saw the dozens of tiny bleeding cuts on her face and legs from the thorny brush. He saw the thick layer of rust and dirt coating her skin. But beneath all the pain and grime, he saw the fierce burning intelligence that had kept her alive when most adults would have simply given up and died. She looked at the giant scarred man and asked him a simple question. She asked if the bad man was finally going away for good. Gideon reached out a massive finger and gently wiped a streak of dirt from her cheek. He spoke with absolute conviction. He told her that the bad man was never going to lay a single finger on her or anyone else ever again. He told her that he promised. Maya studied the hard lines of his weathered face for a long, silent moment. She had been lied to constantly over the past 47 hours. Adults made promises all the time that they had absolutely no intention of keeping. The man at the park had promised her candy and a ride to her father. He had delivered poison and a cage. But as she stared into the cold steel eyes of the giant biker, she saw something completely different. She saw something incredibly old and unbending and absolutely certain. She tilted her small head and asked him to say it again. "Promise, promise," she asked. The dual repeated words struck Gideon straight in the center of his chest. It felt like a physical blow to his heart. His daughter Meredith used to say those exact same words when she was a tiny child. Whenever she wanted him to be absolutely certain about something important, she would make him repeat the word twice. "Promise, promise, Daddy." It was a childish belief that doubling the word doubled the magic power of the vow. He had promised to keep his little girl safe from the dark world. He had utterly failed to keep that sacred promise. He swallowed hard, trying to clear the sudden, thick lump forming in his throat. He looked directly into the eyes of the little girl he had just saved. "Promise, promise," he replied, his voice rough and thick with emotion. Maya reached out her small, fragile hand. She gently touched the thick, worn leather of his cut-off vest. She traced the outline of the black Guardian's shield patch stitched over his heart with one tiny finger. Her hand was so small against the dark leather. It looked impossibly fragile, but he knew it possessed the strength of a survivor. She looked up at Moem and said that her grandmother had always warned her that bikers were very scary people. Gideon let out a small, genuine sigh. He admitted that her grandmother was not entirely wrong, but Maya smiled a tiny, weary smile. She said that even though he was scary, he had helped her when she needed it most. Gideon felt the massive glacier of ice surrounding his heart shift and crack. He told her that sometimes the world required scary people to step up and do the right thing. He told her that sometimes it took a monster to fight other monsters. The little girl completely relaxed her shoulders for the first time in 2 days. She leaned her head back against Sloane's arm. She whispered that she really liked the sound of that. Monsters that fight monsters. The distant wail of police sirens finally became audible over the wind. The sound grew steadily louder as multiple vehicles approached down the long highway. Bright red and blue emergency lights began to violently strobe and flicker through the high windows of the tavern, painting the dark interior in flashing patriotic colors. The first county sheriff cruiser tore into the gravel parking lot and skidded to a halt near the stolen black SUV. Sloan looked down at her glowing laptop screen and then looked up at Gideon with an expression of deep concern. She informed him that she had dug deeper into the background of Hollis Thorne while he was being dragged away. She stated that the man had an extensive history. He was actively wanted by federal authorities in 3 surrounding states for a series of highly organized child abductions spanning the last 5 years. He was a ghost they had been hunting for a very long time. Maya reached out and found Gideon's large hand with her small fingers. She squeezed his calloused thumb tightly. She whispered quietly that she had known from the very beginning that the man was evil. She said she could tell because he smiled way too much and the warmth in his mouth never reached his cold, dead eyes. Gideon squeezed her small hand back with gentle, reassuring pressure. He asked her a question he desperately did not want to know the answer to. He asked her exactly how long she had been trapped inside that moving car. The brave facade of the little soldier finally cracked slightly. Her lower lip trembled. She said it felt like a very long time. She said the man had stopped the vehicle many times at different strange houses along the route. She said she had been locked in the car, but she had looked out the tinted windows. She told the quiet room of bikers that she had seen other children looking back at her from the windows of those houses. She said they looked exactly as scared and tired as she felt. The entire tavern went dead silent once again. The only sound was the crackle of police radios outside the door. One of the bikers standing near the bar asked in a strained voice if she was absolutely sure she saw other kids. Maya nodded her head emphatically. She said the bad man had told her that if she was quiet and good, she would eventually get to play with them. But she noted sadly that whenever they stopped at a new house, she never saw the same faces twice. She looked up at Gideon with those ancient, haunting eyes. She asked him where he thought all the other children went. Gideon could not answer her. He simply closed his eyes and shook his head. He could not explain the horrific realities of the dark web and human trafficking to a 6-year-old victim. The answer to her question was a darkness far too deep for any child to comprehend and a burden far too heavy for any adult to carry without breaking. Sloan was already moving before the silence could settle. She grabbed the encrypted smartphone they had recovered from the dashboard of the SUV. She began scrolling rapidly through the menus and hidden files with the urgent precision of a trained military analyst. She called out to Gideon. Her voice was strained and incredibly tight. She told him that they were not just dealing with one lone kidnapper. She explained that the recovered phone contained a massive contact list hidden behind military-grade encryption. It had over 12 different active numbers. It contained heavily coded text conversations detailing logistics and payments. It held GPS coordinates for at least 6 different isolated transfer locations spread across 4 different western states. She looked up from the glowing screen, her face pale beneath her tough exterior. She declared that they had just stumbled onto a massive, highly organized trafficking network. The heavy wooden doors of the tavern burst open. County sheriff deputies and local police officers poured into the room with their weapons drawn and flashlights cutting through the dim interior. They began shouting commands that echoed loudly off the wooden walls, demanding everyone show their hands. The next hour was a blur of highly controlled chaos. It involved endless repetitive statements, taking pictures, cataloging evidence, and answering the same questions that seemed to go in endless circles. First came the local sheriff deputies taking preliminary reports. Then the state police arrived to secure the stolen vehicle. Finally, a stern woman wearing a dark blue windbreaker with bright yellow FBI lettering on the back walked through the door. She introduced herself to the room as Special Agent Cassidy Miller. Throughout the entire chaotic ordeal, Maya refused to let go of Gideon's hand. When the paramedics arrived to gently examine her cuts and bruises, she insisted the giant biker stand right next to the stretcher. When a child psychologist attempted to question her gently about her experience, she wrapped herself in a silver thermal shock blanket and leaned her head against Gideon's heavy leather vest. She loudly told anyone who tried to separate them that she wanted to stay right next to the motorcycle man. She repeated constantly that he had promised to keep her safe and that a promise could never be broken. Agent Cassidy Miller eventually pulled Gideon away from the crowd and led him to a quiet corner of the bar. She was a tall, sharp-featured woman who radiated intense professional authority. She spoke in a low voice that carried an undercurrent of barely contained urgent energy. She told Mr. Vane that he needed to fully comprehend the gravity of the situation. She explained that the man bleeding in his back storage room was a central figure connected to one of the most prolific and elusive child trafficking operations they had ever tracked on the Western Seaboard. She stated they had been actively trying to locate him for over 8 agonizing months with zero success. Gideon crossed his massive arms over his chest and told her he was very happy to be of assistance to the federal government. Miller stared at him seriously without blinking. She told him she was not joking. She pointed toward the SUV outside. She said that the encrypted phone, the coded messages, and the digital contacts they had recovered from the vehicle were the Holy Grail. It was the massive break her entire task force had been desperately praying for. She looked at the giant biker and told him sincerely that he and his men may have just saved the lives of countless other children tonight. Gideon thought about the terrible text messages he had read on that glowing screen. Package acquired, premium price. The casual, calculated horror of treating human children like livestock sold to the highest bidder. He nodded his head once and said, "Good." Miller hesitated for a moment. She seemed to be carefully weighing her next words against federal regulations. She noted that there would likely be intense bureaucratic questions regarding exactly how the suspect had been subdued by a gang of outlaw bikers. She mentioned the severe bruising and broken nose on the suspect's face. She asked carefully if the suspect had violently resisted a lawful citizen's arrest. Gideon looked the federal agent dead in the eyes. He stated flatly that the man had resisted them and they had restrained him using the necessary force. He declared that was the end of the story. Miller stared at the outlaw for a long, silent moment. Gideon could practically see the complex calculations turning behind her eyes. He saw the dedicated federal agent actively weighing strict legal procedures against the raw pursuit of actual justice. Finally, a microscopic ghost of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. She agreed that the man had likely put up quite a fight and injured himself in the process. She reached into the pocket of her windbreaker and retrieved a crisp white business card bearing the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She handed it to Gideon. She told him that if he or any of his patched members heard anything else regarding the network, they were to contact her private cell phone number directly. She specifically instructed him not to go through the local police or the standard tip lines. She wanted direct, unfiltered communication. The frantic sound of tires screeching onto the gravel lot interrupted them. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and bruising orange. The moment the battered pickup truck slammed into park, Gideon knew exactly who had arrived. A woman tumbled frantically out of the passenger seat before the truck had even fully stopped moving. She hit the ground running and screaming a single name at the top of her lungs. Maya. Maya, the little girl who had been dozing lightly against Sloane's shoulder on the pool table, snapped her head up. Her eyes went wide with sudden disbelief. "Mommy," she cried out. Grace Sterling ran across the chaotic parking lot as if she were actively being chased by a pack of demons. Her face was a tragic, twisted mask of desperate, blinding hope and devastating, lingering fear. She was still wearing her blue nursing scrubs from her shift at the county hospital. She had literally walked out of the building mid-procedure the second the police had called her cell phone. Her husband, David, was right behind her, matching her frantic pace. He was a very large, broad-shouldered man with thick, calloused hands. Fine wood dust still clung to his hair and the shoulders of his flannel shirt. Hot tears were streaming freely down his weathered face, carving clean lines through the dirt and sawdust on his cheeks. Grace collapsed hard onto her knees the moment she reached her daughter. She threw her arms completely around the small, fragile body and buried her face in the dirty, matted hair. The sounds the mother made were not actual human words. They were sounds of pure, raw, unfiltered emotion. It was the crushing grief and paralyzing terror of 47 hours instantly transforming into an overwhelming tidal wave of relief. She rocked back and forth, wailing, "My baby, my baby, my baby," over and over again. Maya wrapped her thin arms around her mother's neck and began to sob openly. The tough little soldier who had stared down a room full of killers finally cracked completely and allowed herself to become a frightened little girl again. She cried into her mother's shoulder and told her how scared she had been in the dark car. But then she pulled back slightly and pointed a trembling finger directly at Gideon Vane. She told her parents that the giant motorcycle man had saved her life. She said he had made a promise, and he had not let the bad man take her away. David Sterling stood up slowly and turned to look directly at Gideon. He really looked at him for the first time. He saw the faded leather cutoff vest. He saw the aggressive dark tattoos wrapping around his thick arms. He saw the jagged white scars crossing the man's face and the cold, hard look in his steel eyes. Absolutely everything about the giant biker should have immediately triggered massive alarm bells in the mind of a protective suburban father. Everything about Gideon Vane screamed violence and danger and criminality. But David Sterling did not see a dangerous criminal standing in front of him. He saw the guardian angel who had stood tall and protected his only child when he had been completely unable to do so himself. The large carpenter stepped forward, his voice cracked heavily like thick ice breaking on a frozen spring river. He told Gideon that he had saved her. He repeated it, saying that he had saved their little girl from monsters. Gideon slowly shook his heavy head. He refused to accept the credit. He told the father that the little girl had saved herself. He explained that she was the one who was smart enough to escape the vent and run through the woods. He said she was the one brave enough to kick open the doors of an outlaw bar and demand sanctuary from strangers who looked exactly like villains. He declared firmly that she was the single bravest kid he had ever seen in his entire life. David Sterling's voice broke, completely losing all composure. He confessed that they thought they would never see her face again after the police had told them the statistics. He reached out his thick, rough hand toward the biker. Gideon reached out and firmly shook it. He felt the deep, heavy calluses of a hardworking man gripping his hand with the desperate strength of a father who had just been handed his entire world back from the edge of the abyss. David told him he had no idea how to properly thank him and that he had no words left. He swore he would spend the rest of his natural life trying to repay the massive debt he owed the club. Gideon looked at the weeping family and told him absolutely no repayment of any kind was necessary or expected. He simply instructed the father to take his little girl back home to her bedroom and let her go back to being a normal kid again. Grace Sterling finally looked up from the floor, where she was still clutching Maya incredibly tight, as if terrified she might vanish into thin air if she let go. Her face was completely destroyed and rebuilt by the violent swings of emotion. Her mascara was running in dark streaks down her cheeks. Her hair was a disheveled mess, and she looked absolutely incredibly beautiful in her absolute pure relief. She looked up at the giant biker and asked a very simple question. She asked him why. She asked why he had chosen to help a random child he did not know. She pointed out that he had absolutely zero reason to get involved in such a dangerous and messy situation. Gideon stood perfectly still and thought deeply about her question. He thought about all the easy generic answers he could quickly give her to make her go away. He could say it was simply the right thing to do. He could say that any decent person would have done the exact same thing in his position. He could say that underneath the leather, they were just regular guys. But Maya was watching him closely. Her face was pressed tightly against her mother's shoulder, but those ancient old soul eyes were locked onto his, waiting patiently for the absolute truth. He opened his mouth and heard himself speak words he had kept locked away in a dark vault for 20 years. He told the mother that he used to have a beautiful daughter once too. The heavy words were dragged up from somewhere impossibly deep inside his chest. He explained that if she had lived, she would be 34 years old today. He told them that she had been brutally taken from him when she was only 14 years old. He said she had been grabbed by bad men while simply walking home from a friend's house in broad daylight. The entire parking lot went incredibly quiet. Even the busy police officers actively processing the crime scene seemed to pause their work and listen to the giant man speak. He told them the police had finally found her body a week later in a ditch. He did not need to elaborate or say anything more. Everyone standing in the circle completely understood exactly what the phrase "found her" meant in that specific horrific context. He looked down at his heavy, scarred hands. His voice grew incredibly rough and thick with unshed tears. He said he had not been there to protect his little girl when she needed him most. He confessed he had spent the last 20 long years living every single day with that crushing guilt. He looked back up at the family. He told them that every single kid he managed to help and every single predator he managed to stop did not magically bring Meredith back to life. He knew nothing in the universe could ever bring her back to him. But he told them it meant she did not die for absolutely nothing. He said her painful memory was the shield that now protected other kids exactly like Maya. He said the ghost of his little girl now stood firmly between innocent children and the dark monsters who wanted to hurt them. Grace Sterling slowly stood up from the floor while still holding her daughter tightly to her chest. She stepped forward and did something Gideon absolutely never expected to happen. She threw her free arm around his thick neck and hugged him. This complete stranger, this violent outlaw biker, this terrifying giant man with the hard eyes and the scarred hands. She wrapped her arm around his leather vest and held onto him like he was the only floating life raft in a violent, raging storm. She whispered softly into his ear. She thanked him from the bottom of her heart for saving their precious baby, and she told him she was so incredibly sorry about what had happened to his. Gideon stood completely rigid as a board for a long moment. He was entirely unprepared for the sudden physical contact and the genuine maternal warmth radiating from a woman entirely outside of his tight-knit brotherhood. He had spent 20 hard years purposefully keeping every single person at arm's length. He had built massive emotional walls high enough and thick enough that absolutely no one could ever see the broken, weeping man hiding behind them. But then, very slowly and very carefully, his massive tattooed arms came up and he gently hugged the crying mother back. Maya reached out her small hand and patted his broad leather shoulder. She told Mr. Nash in a soft but incredibly certain voice not to be sad anymore. She stated confidently that his daughter Meredith was living up in heaven now, and that she was very happy he had saved her life today. She finished by saying that Meredith had told her so directly. Gideon's vision instantly blurred with thick, hot tears he could no longer hold back. He looked down at the little girl and asked, in a shaking whisper, if his daughter had really told her that. Maya nodded her head with extreme solemnity. She explained that when she was running frantically toward the heavy wooden doors of the bar, she had been so incredibly terrified. She said her legs were burning with pain, and she could not catch her breath. She said she truly believed the bad man was finally going to catch her and drag her back to the cage. But then she said she heard a clear voice in the wind. She said it was the voice of a teenage girl. The voice had told her to run straight toward the building because the men inside would help her. She said the voice specifically promised that her daddy would keep her safe. Maya smiled and said she just did exactly what the voice told her to do. The entire world completely stopped making sense to Gideon Vane for a long, beautiful moment. The noisy, chaotic parking lot, the flashing red and blue police lights, the static murmur of the police dispatch radios, all of it faded away into absolute nothingness. He felt something bloom inside his chest that he had not felt in 20 dark years. It was something incredibly fragile and warm that might have been actual hope or perhaps genuine peace, or maybe just the very first small step on the long, difficult road toward forgiving himself. He quickly wiped his wet eyes with the rough back of his hand. He smiled a watery smile and told the little girl that it sounded exactly like something his stubborn daughter would say. The Sterling family stayed at the tavern for another full hour, giving detailed official statements to the federal agents and answering endless questions while holding on to each other as if they were terrified to separate for even a single second. Before they finally packed into the pickup truck to leave, Maya absolutely insisted on walking around and saying a proper personal goodbye to every single biker in the room. She walked up and hugged Jax, who looked incredibly uncomfortable but smiled brightly anyway. She gave a massive high five to the giant man at the end of the bar, her tiny hand completely disappearing inside his massive palm. She told a heavily tattooed biker that his ink was very pretty and asked if the snake on his arm was friendly. She made Sloan cross her heart and promised to come visit her soon. And when she finally walked back over to Gideon, she looked up at him with those deep, ancient eyes and said something that would stay burned into his soul for the rest of his natural life. She pointed her finger at his chest and told him that he was her personal angel now. She asked him if he knew that. Gideon crouched down one last time. He told her he had been called a lot of terrible things in his long life, but nobody had ever called him an angel before. Maya smiled and told him that he definitely was one, even if he did not have soft white wings on his back. She paused for a moment, considering the logistics. She smiled brighter and suggested that perhaps his loud motorcycle was his wings. Gideon threw his head back and laughed out loud despite absolutely everything. Despite the crushing grief and the blinding rage and the 20 years of suffocating darkness, this tiny 6-year-old girl covered in dirt had somehow made him laugh from his belly. He agreed that maybe she was right. She asked him if he would come visit her house if his motorcycle wings could fly that far. Gideon looked up at Grace Sterling, who immediately nodded her head with fresh tears shining on her cheeks. She told the giant outlaw that he was welcome to come to their home anytime he wanted, and that their door would always be open to him and all of his brothers. Maya tugged excitedly on her mother's sleeve and asked if the motorcycle man could come to her birthday party in September when she turned 7. David Sterling stepped forward and shook Gideon's hand one final time. He looked the biker in the eye and told him he meant every single word he had said earlier. He told him if the club ever needed absolutely anything at all to just call. Gideon told the father that taking good care of that little girl was the only payment he would ever need or accept. They finally climbed into the battered truck and drove slowly away as the darkness of the night fully enveloped the mountains. Maya rolled down the back window and waved her small hand enthusiastically until the taillights of the truck completely disappeared around the bend of the mountain road. Gideon stood completely alone in the center of the gravel parking lot long after the sound of their engine faded away. The other patched bikers had given him a wide berth, understanding that certain emotional moments needed to be processed in absolute solitude. Finally, the president of the Black Guardians turned around and walked slowly back into the brightly lit bar. He looked at the men standing around waiting for his command. He simply said the word meeting and pointed toward the back. They immediately gathered in the private soundproof back room of the Iron Sanctuary. 12 hardened men sat around a massive worn wooden table scarred with knife marks and burn rings. The heavy steel door was pulled completely closed and locked from the inside. This was the sacred space where they made their most serious life and death decisions away from the prying eyes and listening ears of the outside world. Gideon stood at the head of the long table. He placed his massive hands flat against the rough wood and leaned forward. He looked into the eyes of his brothers. He told them flatly that what they had seen today and what they had discovered inside that black vehicle meant that this situation was nowhere near over. Sloan had her glowing laptop open on the table and was projecting highly encrypted information onto the blank white wall behind her. She reported that she had been rapidly digging deep through the phone records pulled from Hollis Thorne. She confirmed there were 12 active high-level contacts inside the network. She had found heavily coded communications going back over 18 full months. She pointed out that there were at least 6 specific locations mentioned repeatedly as transfer points spread across the neighboring states. Jax leaned forward, his face twisted in disgust. He asked the room what exactly they were transferring. He asked if it was really just kids. Sloane's voice remained completely flat and rigidly professional, but her hands were shaking slightly over the keyboard. She confirmed it was children. She explained that the monsters called them packages to detach themselves. She said they had an entire disgusting terminology system based on weight classes and condition ratings and delivery schedules. She told the room of outlaws that these evil people were running a massive human trafficking operation exactly like it was a standard corporate logistics business. The heavy silence that followed her presentation was thick and heavy with murderous fury. One of the older bikers spoke up. He pointed out that the FBI currently possessed the phone and all the evidence. He noted that Agent Miller seemed like a solid, competent cop. He suggested they let the federal government handle the massive investigation. Gideon asked the room if they truly believed the government would handle it efficiently. He asked Sloan how long she had said the FBI had been actively tracking these people. She replied that Miller admitted they had been hunting them for over 2 years. Gideon asked what the FBI actually had to show for 2 years of work, besides a pile of paperwork and missing kids. Sloan explained the realities of the legal system. She said the federal agencies were constantly bogged down by massive jurisdictional issues. She said these specific criminal operations purposely worked across multiple state lines to create massive bureaucratic tangles. She explained that by the time the federal, state, and local agencies properly coordinated their efforts and acquired legal warrants, the targets had already moved and vanished. She stated it was a feature designed into the network to beat the slow-moving law. Gideon had been quiet for several minutes, letting his mind process the tactical situation. He finally spoke up. He reminded the room that the little girl Maya had clearly stated she saw other children locked inside the houses. He pointed out that she said they kept moving her constantly and she never saw the same kids twice. He looked at Sloan and asked her to confirm what that meant tactically. She confirmed it meant the children were actively being moved rapidly through a continuous pipeline. She said they were being handed off from one handler to another. She hypothesized that some ended up with wealthy domestic buyers, while others were shipped completely overseas into the dark. The horrifying word overseas hung in the stale air of the room like a heavy iron death sentence. A biker named Bear asked the president what exactly he expected a bunch of mechanics and truckers and construction workers to do about an international federal crime ring. He pointed out they were not sworn police officers. Gideon agreed completely that they were not cops, but he walked slowly over to the small window, looking out at the darkening night sky. The jagged mountains were now pitch-black shapes against the deep purple twilight, standing like silent, eternal witnesses to the evil moving quietly through their hidden valleys. He turned back to face his loyal brothers. He told them that while they were not cops, they intimately knew these hidden back roads better than anyone else. He said they knew the isolated communities and the people who lived in the shadows. He pointed out that they regularly saw things the police never saw because criminals did not hide from bikers the same way they hid from badges. He noted that regular people were certainly scared of their club, but they were not actively performing a fake innocent act for them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crisp white business card. He tossed it onto the center of the wooden table. He told the men that Agent Cassidy Miller had specifically given him her direct private number. He said she told him to contact her if they heard anything at all. He looked at the men and told them what he believed she really meant. He said he believed the FBI agent was silently begging them for help because bikers could go places federal agents could not legally go and could do things federal agents could not legally do. Jax asked the president a serious question. He asked if helping the FBI meant they would be crossing hard legal lines and risking the entire club. Gideon's scarred jaw tightened into a hard block of granite. He told them they would decide their actions on a case-by-case basis. But he reminded them of the undeniable truth of what had happened that afternoon. A terrified 6-year-old girl had run blindly through their front door because she truly believed the scary outlaws might be slightly less dangerous than the monster chasing her. He told the men she had been absolutely right to trust them. He looked around the table at the weathered faces of his men. He reminded them that somewhere out there in the dark, right at this very second, other innocent children were locked in cages waiting and hoping for someone to care enough to come find them. He placed his hands back on the table. He told the room he was not giving a direct presidential order to anyone. He stated clearly that this operation was absolutely not official club business. He declared it was deeply personal to him. He looked at every single man in the eyes and asked simply who was in. Every single callous, scarred hand in the room immediately went up into the air without a moment's hesitation. Gideon nodded his head slowly, taking in the loyalty of his family. He told them to get to work. Sloan began typing furiously. She reported she had partial data on 3 of the specific contact numbers pulled from the phone. She said she was currently cross-referencing them with hidden property records and known criminal associates in the area. She asked for 48 hours to narrow down at least one of the active transfer locations. Gideon told her to do it. Jax leaned forward and asked about Hollis Thorne. He pointed out the man was in federal custody, but he held massive amounts of tactical information regarding the network. He asked if they should try to reach him. Gideon shook his head. He said the FBI would interrogate him relentlessly. But he noted that professional operators like Hollis were significantly more terrified of the powerful people above them in the network than they were of serving time in federal prison. He predicted Hollis would immediately hire an expensive lawyer and clam up completely. He declared the man was absolutely not worth the exposure and risk to the club. He ordered them to do this smart and stay in the shadows or not do it at all. The intense planning meeting went on for another full hour. They assigned specific reconnaissance duties. They established secure communication protocols. They mapped out surveillance schedules. By the time they finally adjourned, the moon was high in the night sky, illuminating the gravel lot. One by one, the brothers fired up their loud engines and headed home into the dark. Gideon Vane was the last man to leave the bar. He slowly walked through the empty, silent main room. He walked past the exact spot where little Maya had crashed desperately into his legs. He walked past the overturned, shattered wooden chair from when Hollis had attempted to run away. He stopped at the heavy front doors and looked back at his sanctuary. 20 long years ago, he had stood freezing in a hospital morgue in Billings and officially identified the pale, lifeless body of his little girl. She was 14 years old, forever frozen in time. She had been wearing the small silver horse charm bracelet he had given her for her birthday. He had spent 2 entire decades channeling his blinding grief and suffocating guilt into the violence of the club. His life had felt like an endless, brutal penance rather than a life with actual purpose. But today, a tiny, bleeding 6-year-old girl had pointed a finger at his chest and called him her angel. She had told him that his Meredith was happy in heaven because he had saved a life. Gideon did not know if he truly believed in heaven or angels. He did not know if he believed in absolutely anything anymore, except the heavy, crushing weight of a promise and the burning, cleansing fire of righteous vengeance. But something had undeniably shifted inside his soul today. Something massive had finally cracked wide open in the frozen, desolate wasteland of his heart. Maybe Maya was actually right. Maybe the spirit of his daughter Meredith had somehow miraculously guided the terrified child straight to that wooden door. Or maybe it was just absolute random coincidence. A desperate, fleeing child choosing the nearest visible shelter from a violent storm. Ultimately, Gideon decided it did not matter either way. The only thing that mattered in the world was that Maya was currently safe asleep in her own bed. The only thing that mattered was that somewhere out there in the cold night, other stolen children were not safe. The only thing that mattered was that Gideon Vane finally had something incredibly important to fight for that went far beyond his own personal grief and suffering. He locked the heavy wooden door behind him and walked slowly to his motorcycle. The night air was freezing. The stars were brilliant and countless in the wide Wyoming sky. It was more stars than a man could ever see in a bright city. He looked up at the vast expanse of space. He decided he had to believe that somewhere up there Meredith was finally watching him with pride. He spoke quietly into the dark, cold night. He promised his baby girl that he was going to find them. He swore he would find every single kid that was still out there waiting and hoping for someone to come kick down the door. He promised he was going to find them all, and he swore that anyone who dared to get in his way would regret the day they were born. He did not need to finish the thought aloud. He swung his heavy leg over the leather seat and kicked the massive engine to life. The heavy Harley-Davidson roared violently beneath him, sounding exactly like a massive mythical beast, finally awakening from a 20-year slumber. The deafening sound of the exhaust echoed loudly off the sheer rock faces of the mountains, loudly announcing his powerful presence to absolutely anyone who might be listening in the dark. He wanted them to hear it. He wanted the cowards hiding in the shadows to know that the monsters they feared were about to learn that there were much bigger, much darker monsters out there hunting them. And these specific monsters had just been given a brand new terrifying purpose by a tiny 6-year-old girl with blood on her bare feet and pure unbreakable steel in her spine. Gideon Vane dropped the bike into gear and rode hard into the absolute darkness. He was the very first soldier marching into a massive, brutal war that absolutely nobody else in the world even knew had started yet. The basement of the Iron Sanctuary was thick with the heavy smell of stale coffee and hot electrical ozone. The massive cooling fans of the custom-built computer servers hummed a low, continuous vibration that rattled the concrete floor. Sloane Whitaker sat completely motionless in the center of the dark room. She was bathed in the pale, ghostly blue light radiating from 3 massive high-definition monitors. Her dark eyes were bloodshot and ringed with deep, exhausted shadows. She had not slept a single minute in over 72 hours. Her fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with the brutal, calculated efficiency of a wartime codebreaker. She refused to stop. She refused to eat. The encrypted smartphone they had ripped from the dashboard of the black utility vehicle lay connected to her central mainframe by a thick black cable. It was the digital beating heart of a monster, and Sloane was systematically tearing it apart line by line of complex code. Gideon Vane stood silently in the doorway watching her work. His massive frame filled the doorframe, blocking out the dim light from the hallway. He held 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. He walked quietly into the room and placed one mug next to her keyboard. He did not speak. He knew better than to interrupt a cryptographer when they were deep inside the digital labyrinth. He simply stood behind her chair and stared at the cascading lines of green text falling across the center screen. Sloane finally stopped typing. She took a slow, deep breath that sounded like a dry rattle in her chest. She reached out and wrapped her hands around the hot coffee mug, letting the heat soak into her freezing fingers. She stared blankly at the screen. She told Gideon in a voice completely devoid of any emotion that she had finally broken through the final firewall. She said she had unlocked the master directory of the phone. Gideon stepped closer. He asked her exactly what she had found in the dark. Sloane turned her chair to face him. Her face was pale as bleached bone. She told him it was so much worse than they had originally thought. She pointed a trembling finger at the glowing screen. She explained that Hollis Thorne was not merely a low-level driver or a street thug. He was a high-ranking logistics coordinator for an elite syndicate. The network called itself the Shepherd. They operated with terrifying corporate efficiency across the entire western half of the country. But the most horrifying part was not their scale. It was their method. Sloane clicked a button and brought up a series of official-looking documents featuring smiling families and bright pastel logos. She explained that Hollis Thorne and his associates hid their monstrous activities behind a fully registered, legitimate nonprofit charity organization. It was called the Safe Haven Foundation. They posed as wealthy, benevolent benefactors. They specifically targeted impoverished neighborhoods in struggling rural towns. They actively sought out desperate single mothers who were drowning in debt and facing eviction. The charity workers would conduct mandatory home visits under the guise of offering financial assistance and warm winter coats. Gideon felt his stomach twist into a cold, hard knot. He realized exactly what she was saying. Sloan confirmed his darkest thoughts. She said the charity workers used those home visits to meticulously scout the children. They looked for the kids who walked to school entirely alone along empty dirt roads. They looked for the houses with broken locks on the back doors. They took detailed psychological profiles of the parents to determine who would be believed by the police and who would be quickly dismissed as unreliable drug addicts or runaways. They actively hunted for the most vulnerable and forgotten children in society. They cataloged them like livestock in a digital ledger. And when the time was perfectly right, the charity would send a man like Hollis Thorne to collect the merchandise. Gideon stared at the smiling logo of the charity on the screen. The sheer absolute betrayal of human trust was staggering. They had taken the most sacred protective instinct of a community and weaponized it into a hunting snare. He asked Sloan where the main office for this charity was located. Sloan pulled up a map. She said the primary operational headquarters was a massive, sprawling suburban estate located just outside the city limits. She said Hollis Thorne owned the property under a dummy corporation. She told Gideon that if there was any physical evidence left connecting the charity to the buyers, it would be locked inside that house. Gideon did not hesitate. He turned and walked out of the basement. He found Jax wiping down the polished chrome of his motorcycle in the main garage. He told the younger biker to grab his heavy coat and his rifle. They were going for a ride into the wealthy suburbs. The night air was freezing as they rode their heavy machines down the winding mountain pass toward the glowing lights of the valley. They did not ride in a loud formation. They kept their engines low and their headlights dim. They moved like silent phantoms, slipping through the dark pines. They parked their motorcycles deep in a heavily wooded ridge that directly overlooked the sprawling estate of Hollis Thorne. The house was a massive structure of stone and glass sitting at the end of a long private driveway. Gideon unslung his high-powered military binoculars and pressed them against his eyes. He expected to see the property surrounded by federal agents wearing yellow FBI windbreakers. He expected to see forensic crime scene units meticulously bagging computer hard drives and paper files. Agent Cassidy Miller had assured him the federal government was moving swiftly on the intelligence they had provided. But the men moving quickly around the brightly lit property were not federal agents. Gideon adjusted the focus dial on the heavy lenses. He recognized the dark tan uniforms and the specific shape of the badges glinting under the security lights. They were local county sheriff's deputies. There were at least a dozen of them swarming the property. But they were not acting like police officers securing a crime scene. They were acting like common thieves scrubbing a hideout. He watched in silent fury as 4 uniformed deputies carried heavy cardboard boxes out the back doors of the mansion. The boxes were overflowing with thick manila folders and stacked paper ledgers. They carried the boxes to a massive rusted steel burn barrel sitting near the edge of the manicured lawn. They dumped the files into the metal drum. Another deputy walked over carrying a red plastic gasoline canister. He dumped fuel generously over the paperwork. He casually struck a road flare and tossed it into the barrel. A massive pillar of bright orange fire erupted into the dark Wyoming sky. The thick black smoke curled upward, carrying the ashes of thousands of ruined lives. Jax lowered his own binoculars. He looked at Gideon with eyes wide with shock and pure rage. He whispered that the local cops were actively burning the evidence. He asked how the corruption could possibly reach that deep into the local badge. Gideon kept his eyes locked on the burning barrel. The bright flames reflected in his cold steel eyes. He told Jax that evil did not care about the color of a uniform. He realized in that terrible moment that they were completely and utterly alone in this war. The legal system was not just slow and bureaucratic. The legal system was actively participating in the slaughter. The men sworn to protect the innocent were standing around a fire destroying the names of the missing. He lowered his binoculars and turned back toward his motorcycle. He told Jax they needed to leave immediately before the deputies spotted them on the ridge. The rules of engagement had just changed drastically. When they returned to the Iron Sanctuary, the sun was just beginning to bleed a pale, sickly gray light over the eastern peaks. Gideon walked straight to his private office and locked the heavy wooden door behind him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crisp white business card. He stared at the name of Special Agent Cassidy Miller. He picked up his secure burner phone and dialed the private number. She answered on the first ring. Her voice was incredibly tight and strained. She did not bother with pleasantries. She told Gideon to meet her in exactly 1 hour at the abandoned drive-in movie theater 10 miles south of town. She explicitly instructed him to come completely alone and to make absolutely sure he was not being followed. She hung up the phone before he could reply. The abandoned drive-in theater was a desolate wasteland of cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds. The massive rusted metal movie screen loomed against the gray morning sky like the tombstone of a forgotten era. Gideon parked his motorcycle behind a crumbling, concrete ticket booth. He walked out into the center of the empty lot. Agent Miller arrived 5 minutes later driving an unmarked dark sedan. She parked 100 yards away and stepped out of the vehicle. She was not wearing her official windbreaker today. She wore a heavy dark coat and she kept her hands shoved deep into her pockets. She looked over her shoulder, scanning the empty horizon before walking quickly toward Gideon. When she reached him, Gideon saw the deep lines of absolute exhaustion and sheer terror etched into her face. The tough, confident federal agent who had commanded the parking lot 2 days ago was completely gone. She looked like a woman standing on the edge of a crumbling cliff. Gideon spoke first. He asked her why local county deputies were throwing critical federal evidence into a bonfire at 3 in the morning. Miller closed her eyes and let out a long, trembling breath. She told him that the federal warrants had been suddenly and inexplicably blocked by a federal judge at midnight. She explained that the moment the warrants were stalled, local jurisdiction automatically took over the property. She said the local sheriff claimed he received an anonymous tip about a fire hazard and sent his men to clear the estate. It was a perfectly orchestrated legal loophole designed specifically to destroy the paper trail. Gideon took a step closer. His massive presence towered over the federal agent. He demanded to know who possessed the power to stall a federal warrant on a massive human trafficking syndicate. Miller looked up at him. Her eyes were wet with tears of absolute frustration and paralyzing fear. She told him the truth. She said her own boss, the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, had personally intervened to delay the warrants. She explained that Sloan had missed a secondary encrypted partition on the smartphone. Miller had brought the device to her own technical team. They had broken the final layer. They had found the master client list. She looked at Gideon and her voice broke completely. She told him the regional director was on that specific list. She said the names on that list were not street thugs or local gang members. They were prominent state politicians, wealthy corporate executives, and high-ranking members of the judicial system. The men buying the children were the exact same men writing the laws and commanding the police. Gideon felt the cold wind rip across the empty asphalt lot. The sheer magnitude of the evil was staggering. The monster was not hiding under the bed. The monster was living in the governor's mansion and sitting behind the judge's bench. Miller took a step back. She told Gideon that he and his motorcycle club were in extreme immediate danger. She explained that the syndicate needed a designated scapegoat to cleanly close the kidnapping case of Maya Sterling to the public. They could not allow the media to dig deeper into the Safe Haven Foundation. They needed a convenient violent villain to take the blame for the entire operation. She warned Gideon that the corrupt local sheriff was currently assembling a heavily armed tactical strike team. They were drafting fake affidavits claiming that the Black Guardians were the actual violent kidnappers who had stolen Maya from the park. They were writing a narrative that Hollis Thorne was simply an innocent citizen trying to rescue the girl from the biker gang. Miller told Gideon that the strike team was not coming to the Iron Sanctuary to arrest them. They were coming under the cover of darkness with shoot-to-kill orders. They were coming to slaughter every single man inside the bar and silence the witnesses forever. Gideon stood perfectly still, absorbing the tactical information. He did not panic. He did not shout. He simply nodded his head slowly. He asked the agent what she was going to do now that she knew her own agency was hopelessly compromised. Miller looked at the ground. She said she was completely paralyzed. If she blew the whistle, the director would simply have her discredited or killed, and the children would vanish forever. She said the system was perfectly rigged to protect the powerful predators at the very top of the food chain. She looked up at the giant biker. She whispered that she was incredibly sorry, but there was absolutely nothing she could do through legal channels to save those missing kids. Gideon reached out and placed his heavy hand on her shoulder. He told her she had already done more than enough. He told her to walk away and keep her head down. He said the legal channels were officially closed, and now the Black Guardians would handle the problem using the old ways. He rode back to the bar with a heart made of solid ice. The battle lines were clearly drawn. They were no longer just a motorcycle club looking into a crime. They were officially hunted outlaws branded as monsters by a corrupt state. But Gideon knew the truth. Sometimes it truly took a monster to burn down a corrupt kingdom. Before he gathered his men for war, he knew he had to do one final, incredibly painful thing. He needed to speak to Maya Sterling one more time. He needed to know exactly what the enemy was holding in the dark. He parked his motorcycle a full block away from the Sterling family home. He walked silently through the back alleys, moving like a shadow until he reached their backyard. He knocked softly on the heavy reinforced back door. David Sterling opened the door holding a heavy steel wrench in his hand. When he saw Gideon standing in the dark, his tense shoulders instantly relaxed. He pulled the biker inside quickly and locked the deadbolt. The house felt like a fortified bunker. All the curtains were drawn tight. Extra heavy-duty locks had been drilled into every single window frame. Grace Sterling was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cold cup of coffee. She looked completely exhausted, but she managed a small, grateful smile when Gideon walked into the room. He asked the parents quietly if he could speak to Maya for just a few minutes. He promised he would not upset her. David nodded and led him into the small living room. Maya was sitting on the carpet surrounded by a colorful scattering of bright crayons and blank construction paper. She was drawing a picture of a large black motorcycle with massive white bird wings attached to the sides. When she saw Gideon, her face lit up with absolute pure joy. She dropped her crayons and ran across the room, throwing her small arms around his thick legs. Gideon knelt down onto the carpet, ignoring the sharp pain in his old knees. He hugged the little girl tightly. He told her she was looking much better today. Maya smiled proudly and pointed to the colorful band-aids covering the scratches on her arms. He asked her very gently if she felt brave enough to talk about the dark houses again for just a little bit. He told her it was incredibly important to help him find the other lost children. Maya lost her bright smile, but she nodded her head bravely. She sat back down on the carpet and crossed her small legs. Gideon sat across from her. He asked her to describe exactly what it was like down in the basements, where the bad men kept them locked up. Maya looked down at her small hands. She spoke in a very quiet voice. She said it was always freezing cold and completely dark. She said they slept on dirty mattresses thrown on the hard concrete floor. But then she looked up and told Gideon something that made his blood run cold. She said the bad men never stayed down in the dark with them. She said the bad men made the older girls take care of all the little kids. Gideon leaned forward carefully. He asked her what she meant by the older girls taking care of them. Maya explained that whenever a new little kid was thrown down into the basement, crying and terrified, one of the older girls would crawl over and hug them. The older girl would tell them the rules of the dark house. She would teach them how to stay very quiet so the bad men would not come down the stairs and hit them with the heavy belts. She said the older girls would share their small portions of stale food and water with the babies. They acted like mothers in the dark. Gideon felt a terrible crushing pressure building inside his chest. He asked Maya if she had ever spoken to one of these older girls. Maya shook her head. She said the older girls in her specific basement were too scared to talk much, but she said they told her a story. They told her a legend that all the lost kids whispered to each other in the dark to stay brave. It was a story about the very first girl who had ever been brought to the dark houses a long, long time ago. Gideon could not breathe. His massive lungs completely seized up. He asked her in a ragged whisper to tell him the story. Maya looked at him with her deep, ancient eyes. She said the story was about a teenage girl with very dark hair. The bad men had locked her in the very first basement many years ago. But the girl was incredibly brave. When the bad men brought more frightened little kids down the stairs, she fought the bad men with her bare hands to protect the babies. She took the terrible beatings so the little ones would not have to suffer. Maya said the older kids told her that the brave girl used to sing a beautiful song about a wild running horse to help the babies fall asleep despite the terrible cold and the hunger. A single hot tear escaped the corner of Gideon's eye and tracked slowly down his scarred cheek. He knew exactly what song that was. He used to sing it to his daughter when she was a toddler. Maya continued her story. She said the brave girl wore a very special, magical bracelet on her wrist. It had a tiny, shiny silver horse charm dangling from it. She said the brave girl would let the crying babies hold the silver horse charm in their tiny hands in the pitch-black dark. The smooth, cold metal made them feel safe. It made them feel like someone in the world actually cared about them. Maya finished the story by saying the brave girl protected the babies for a very long time until she eventually got too sick and too tired. One day, the bad men finally came down the stairs and dragged her away. The kids never saw her again. But they kept telling her story to every single new kid who arrived so nobody would ever forget how to be brave. Gideon Vane fell completely silent. He stared at the colorful crayon drawing of the winged motorcycle on the floor, but he did not actually see it. His mind was ripped completely backward through 20 years of agonizing time. The realization hit his massive chest like a speeding freight train composed of solid grief and pure horror. His daughter, his beautiful, precious 14-year-old Meredith. She had not died on the very first day she was taken from the street. She had not been immediately murdered and dumped in a ditch by a random passing predator. She had been taken by the syndicate. She had been thrown into the deep, dark belly of the trafficking network. And instead of breaking down and surrendering to the evil, she had fought back. She had spent the last agonizing months of her short, brutalized life acting as a fierce protector for the younger stolen children. She had become a literal shepherd for the lost lambs trapped in the slaughterhouse. She had taken the savage beatings to spare the innocent. She had sung them lullabies in the absolute dark. She had given them her own tiny silver horse charm to hold on to for comfort while she slowly died of starvation and exhaustion. She had not died a helpless, forgotten victim. She had died an absolute legendary warrior in the dark. The 20 years of suffocating, crushing guilt that Gideon had carried on his broad shoulders instantly evaporated. It did not disappear, but it fundamentally changed its molecular structure. The dark, heavy lead of his grief transmuted instantly into a blinding, white-hot core of pure atomic rage. He stood up from the carpet. He felt incredibly light. He felt like a man who had finally discovered the true profound purpose of his violent existence. He looked down at Maya. He reached out and gently touched the top of her head. He thanked her for telling him the story. He told her it was the most beautiful, important story he had ever heard in his entire life. He turned and walked back into the kitchen. He looked at David and Grace Sterling. He told them to pack a few bags immediately. He told them they needed to leave the house tonight and drive to a motel 3 towns over and pay entirely in cash. He warned them that a massive storm was coming to the valley and they needed to be far away when the lightning struck. He walked out the back door and rode back to the Iron Sanctuary. The bar was completely closed to the public. The neon beer signs in the front windows were turned off. The heavy steel security shutters were pulled down tight over the glass. Inside the dim, cavernous space, 30 heavily armed men were quietly preparing for war. Gideon had called in the presidents of 3 neighboring allied motorcycle clubs. The room was packed with hardened combat veterans, mechanics, and roughnecks cleaning rifles, checking ammunition magazines, and strapping heavy ceramic ballistic plates tightly over their leather vests. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly tense but completely focused. They all knew the corrupt local law enforcement was coming to slaughter them tonight. They all knew they were about to cross a massive line from which there was absolutely zero return. Gideon walked to the center of the room. The men stopped working and looked at their leader. He did not give them a loud, screaming motivational speech. He did not talk about brotherhood or honor or club loyalty. He spoke in a very quiet, deadly voice that carried clearly to every dark corner of the tavern. He told them exactly what Maya had just told him. He told them the story of the brave teenage girl with the dark hair and the silver horse bracelet. He told them how his daughter had spent the last months of her life protecting the babies in the dark. He told them that she had fought the monsters with her bare hands until they finally killed her. He looked around the room at the hardened killer standing before him. He saw tears standing in the eyes of men who had spent time in maximum security prisons. He saw massive bearded outlaws clenching their fists so hard their knuckles popped loudly in the silence. He told them that the syndicate had taken his little girl and turned her into a shield. He told them that tonight the Black Guardians were going to become the sword. He declared that they were no longer simply defending their bar from corrupt cops. They were going to actively hunt down every single man involved in the network. They were going to burn the Safe Haven Foundation to the ground. They were going to find the master ledger. And they were going to bring every single missing child back out into the sunlight. He finished by telling them that anyone who wanted to walk out the back door and go home to their families could leave right now with absolutely no judgment and no questions asked. Not a single man in the room moved an inch toward the exit. Jax racked the heavy slide of his shotgun. Bear slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle. Sloane pulled down her tactical goggles. They were all completely ready to ride into hell. The attack came at exactly 2 in the morning. There were no wailing police sirens. There were no flashing red and blue emergency lights. The corrupt strike team arrived in 4 massive, unmarked black tactical vans. They killed their headlights a block away and rolled completely silently into the gravel parking lot of the Iron Sanctuary. Over 20 heavily armed mercenaries poured out of the back doors of the vans. They were dressed in sterile black tactical gear without a single identifying police badge or name tape. They carried suppressed automatic weapons and heavy breaching equipment. They moved with smooth, deadly military precision, spreading out to completely surround the large wooden building. They were not here to make a legal arrest. They were an extermination squad. The leader of the tactical team approached the heavy front double doors holding a massive steel battering ram. He raised his hand to signal the breach. Before he could swing the heavy steel ram, the front doors of the tavern violently exploded outward in a massive shower of splintered wood and fire. The bikers had not waited passively inside to be slaughtered like trapped rats. They had actively rigged the heavy front entrance with commercial-grade mining explosives. The concussive blast threw the first wave of mercenaries violently backward across the gravel lot. Before the thick smoke from the explosion could clear, the Black Guardians opened fire from heavily fortified positions inside the building. The dark night erupted into absolute deafening chaos. Muzzle flashes strobed wildly from the upper floor windows of the tavern, painting the dark parking lot in violent, stuttering flashes of yellow light. Heavy caliber rifle rounds ripped completely through the thin metal siding of the unmarked vans, tearing into the men hiding behind them. The mercenaries quickly recovered from the initial shock and returned heavy, suppressed fire. Thousands of bullets chewed relentlessly into the thick wooden walls of the bar. Glass shattered everywhere. The air was incredibly thick, with the choking smell of cordite and pulverized brick dust. Gideon stood positioned behind the massive solid oak bar, pouring heavy rifle fire through the shattered front window. He moved with a terrifying, calm, calculating efficiency. He did not spray bullets wildly into the dark. He picked his targets, precisely dropping the advancing mercenaries one by one. The firefight was incredibly brutal and kinetic, but it was over in less than 10 minutes. The mercenaries had expected to easily surprise a bunch of drunk, sleeping bikers. They had absolutely not expected to assault a heavily fortified military bunker manned by combat veterans expecting a war. When the mercenary leader realized his squad was being systematically decimated from superior firing positions, he ordered an immediate total retreat. The surviving tactical operators scrambled frantically back into the two remaining functional vans. Tires squealed violently on the bloody gravel as the vans tore out of the parking lot and disappeared rapidly into the night. They left behind 6 dead men lying completely still in the dirt, but they also left behind one man who was very much alive. Jax and Bear dragged a severely wounded mercenary through the shattered front doors and threw him roughly onto the glass-covered floor of the main bar. The man had taken a grazing rifle round to the thigh and could not run to the retreating vans. He was wearing expensive tactical gear, but his eyes were wide with pure panic. Gideon walked slowly over to the bleeding man. He slung his hot rifle over his shoulder. He looked down at the mercenary. He did not ask him for his name or his rank. He did not care about the corrupt local sheriff who had hired him. He only cared about one single piece of operational intelligence. He crouched down and pressed his massive, heavy thumb directly into the bleeding bullet wound on the man's leg. The mercenary screamed in absolute agony, thrashing wildly against the heavy boots of the bikers, pinning his shoulders to the floor. Gideon leaned in close and whispered into his ear. He told the man he had exactly 5 seconds to tell him where the syndicate was moving the current inventory of children. He told him if he did not speak, the next bullet would shatter his kneecap into powder. The mercenary gasped for breath, his face pale and sweating profusely. He realized he was not dealing with a police officer bound by civil rights. He was dealing with a monster who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He choked out the location between ragged gasps of pain. He said the remaining children had been rapidly moved from the holding houses because of the recent heat. He said the syndicate was liquidating the local assets tonight. He told Gideon the children were currently sitting in a holding hangar at the Grey Bull private airfield, located 40 miles north in the deep mountains. He coughed up blood and said a chartered international cargo plane was scheduled to take off at exactly midnight. He said there were 11 packages waiting on the tarmac. Gideon stood up slowly. He looked at the large clock hanging crookedly on the bullet-riddled wall behind the bar. It was currently 2:30 in the morning. The flight was not scheduled until tomorrow midnight. They had exactly 21 hours to travel 40 miles, heavily arm themselves, plan a tactical assault on a fortified private airfield, and rescue 11 terrified children from the belly of the beast. He looked down at the bleeding mercenary on the floor. He ordered Jax to bind the man's wounds tight enough so he would not bleed to death, and then lock him securely in the basement vault. Gideon turned to his brothers. The bar was completely destroyed. The mirrors were shattered, The pool tables were splintered into kindling, and the walls were riddled with thousands of holes. But not a single patched member of the Black Guardians had suffered a fatal wound. They were bleeding and bruised, but they were fully alive, and their blood was boiling hot. He raised his voice above the ringing in their ears. He told them the corrupt law had tried to execute them and bury the truth. He told them they were officially outlaws, now actively hunted by the state. He said there was absolutely no going back to their old quiet lives. He told them they were going to ride north to the mountains. They were going to hit that private airfield with everything they possessed. They were going to tear the wings off that plane, and they were going to bring those 11 lost babies home, or they were all going to die trying. The men roared their absolute approval into the smoky air. They grabbed their heavy gear and marched out to their motorcycles. The final ride was about to begin. The deep black sky over the Wyoming mountains was completely devoid of stars. Thick, heavy storm clouds had rolled across the jagged peaks, blotting out the pale light of the moon. The freezing wind howled through the narrow mountain passes, carrying the bitter scent of crushed pine needles and impending violent rain. The isolated two-lane blacktop highway cutting through the high-elevation wilderness was entirely empty. To a casual observer, the world appeared perfectly still and asleep, but the earth itself was beginning to quietly vibrate. Deep inside the treacherous switchbacks and hidden logging roads, an absolute massive mechanical army was quietly assembling in the absolute dark. Gideon Vane rode at the very front of the sprawling formation. He rode his heavy customized motorcycle with the headlights completely turned off. He navigated the treacherous winding mountain curves using only his raw instinct and his decades of intimate knowledge of the brutal landscape. Behind him, stretching for over 2 solid miles down the mountain road, was a staggering display of raw, organized mechanical power. He had not just called upon the patched members of the Black Guardians, he had initiated a sacred ancient protocol among the outlaw motorcycle clubs of the American West. A call that had not been officially invoked in over 40 years. He had reached out to the sitting presidents of the Iron Skulls, the Desert Hounds, the Ghost Riders, and the Steel Prophets. He had told them a very simple, devastating truth over the secure phone lines. He told them that wealthy, corrupt politicians were actively buying and selling stolen children in their own backyards, and the federal government was actively helping them burn the evidence. The response from the outlaw world had been immediate and overwhelming. Over 500 heavily armed bikers were currently rolling down the mountain in absolute terrifying silence. They rode shoulder to shoulder, filling both lanes of the highway. The collective low rumbling vibration of 500 massive combustion engines created a deep, heavy acoustic wave that physically shook the dust from the pine trees. It was a rolling earthquake of heavy American steel and righteous, furious vengeance. They were men who had been marginalized and hunted by polite society for their entire lives. They were combat veterans who had been chewed up and spit out by foreign wars. They were roughnecks and mechanics and laborers. But tonight they were an unstoppable army of dark guardian angels descending directly into the fires of hell. 40 miles to the north, the private Grey Bull airfield sat quietly nestled in a flat, shallow valley surrounded by sheer granite cliffs. The perimeter of the facility was heavily secured by 10-foot-high chain-link fences topped with gleaming razor wire. Powerful halogen security lights bathed the cracked concrete tarmac in a harsh, artificial white glare. Sitting idle in the very center of the illuminated runway was a massive twin-engine international cargo plane. Its heavy rear loading ramp was lowered to the ground like the gaping dark maw of a metal leviathan waiting to be fed. Standing near the base of the loading ramp was the true architect of the nightmare. He was an older, distinguished-looking man wearing an incredibly expensive tailored cashmere overcoat. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His posture was rigid and completely authoritative. To the general public, he was known as the Honorable Arthur Sterling, a highly respected, sitting federal judge with immense political power and deep ties to the regional director of the FBI. But in the dark criminal underworld, he was simply known as the Shepherd. He was the supreme leader of the entire trafficking syndicate. Standing nervously a few feet behind the corrupt judge was Hollis Thorne. The polished logistics coordinator looked significantly worse than he had 2 days ago. His expensive polo shirt was torn and filthy. His nose was heavily bandaged, and his face was severely bruised from his violent encounter at the outlaw bar. He was sweating profusely despite the freezing mountain wind. Surrounding the cargo plane and patrolling the perimeter fences were over 40 heavily armed private military contractors. They carried suppressed automatic rifles and wore advanced tactical communication headsets. They were highly trained, ruthless killers who were being paid an absolute fortune to ensure the high-value cargo boarded the plane without a single incident. The cargo was currently huddled together on the freezing concrete of the tarmac. 11 children were sitting in a tight circle near the wheels of the massive aircraft. They were all under the age of 10. They were shivering violently in the bitter cold. Heavy plastic zip ties bound their small wrists together in a long, continuous chain. Their eyes were wide and completely hollow. They had been starved and sedated and dragged through the dark houses of the syndicate until their small spirits were on the absolute verge of breaking completely. Judge Sterling looked at a gold pocket watch. He snapped it shut and looked at Hollis Thorne with an expression of pure, cold disgust. He told the battered logistics coordinator that the recent operational sloppiness was completely unacceptable. He stated that losing the Sterling girl to a gang of filthy, uneducated bikers had cost the syndicate millions of dollars in bribes to silence the local sheriff's department and stall the federal warrants. He told Hollis that once the plane was safely in the air and the merchandise was delivered overseas, there would be a very serious internal reckoning regarding his continued employment. Hollis swallowed hard and nervously adjusted his coat. He placed his right hand over the heavy bulge of his backup pistol tucked securely into his waistband. He had lost his primary weapon during the struggle at the bar, but he had managed to retrieve his hidden backup piece from the center console of the black utility vehicle before the police impounded it. He assured the wealthy judge that the situation was entirely under control and that the bikers were currently being exterminated by the local strike team back at their bar. He was absolutely, completely wrong. The first subtle warning sign that the world was about to end came from the ground itself. The heavily armed mercenaries patrolling the outer perimeter fences stopped walking. They looked down at their tactical boots. Small, loose pebbles on the concrete tarmac began to slowly vibrate and dance. The half-empty plastic water bottles sitting on the hood of the security vehicles began to ripple with tiny concentric circles. Then came the sound. It did not sound like vehicles approaching. It sounded like a massive, unnatural weather phenomenon. It was a deep, heavy acoustic drone that reverberated violently off the granite cliffs surrounding the valley. It sounded like a massive swarm of angry mechanical hornets amplifying and multiplying in the dark air. The commander of the mercenary unit raised his radio to his mouth and ordered his men to lock their weapons and scan the tree line. He raised his night vision goggles to his eyes and looked toward the dark ridges overlooking the airfield. Suddenly, the darkness of the surrounding mountains was completely obliterated. Simultaneously on the high ridges surrounding the entire valley, 500 motorcycles clicked on their high-beam headlights at the exact same second. The visual effect was absolutely staggering. A continuous blinding wall of brilliant white light completely encircled the entire valley, pointing directly down at the airfield. It looked as if a ring of fallen stars had suddenly landed on the peaks. The mercenaries recoiled, raising their hands to shield their eyes from the blinding glare. Then the outlaws rolled the throttles of their massive engines wide open. The acoustic shockwave of 500 heavy combustion engines revving to maximum capacity simultaneously in a closed mountain basin was physically devastating. The sheer volume of the roaring steel machines was louder than a commercial jet taking off. It vibrated violently in the chest cavities of the men on the ground. It shattered the thick glass windows of the small control tower. It was a pure, concentrated psychological assault designed to instill absolute primal terror. The mercenaries were highly trained for organized urban combat. They were trained to fight federal agents or rival tactical teams. They were completely unprepared for a screaming horde of 500 heavily armored outlaws pouring down the sides of the mountain like a torrential avalanche of chrome and black leather. The bikers did not stop at the heavy chain-link gates. They did not slow down to cut the locks. The massive leading element of the formation simply drove their heavy steel reinforced motorcycles directly into the chain-link perimeter at 50 miles an hour. The heavy fences violently buckled and snapped under the sheer kinetic mass of the machines. The outlaw army poured onto the illuminated tarmac like a tidal wave of righteous fury. Gideon Vane rode at the very tip of the spear. He did not carry a firearm in his hands. He swung a massive heavy steel logging chain in a wide, brutal arc over his head. The heavy metal links whistled fiercely through the freezing air. The mercenary commander panicked and raised his automatic rifle toward the advancing wall of motorcycles. Before he could even squeeze the trigger, the heavy logging chain swung by Gideon struck him directly in the center of his tactical helmet. The massive kinetic impact lifted the commander completely off his feet and threw him violently to the concrete. He did not get back up. The remaining mercenaries completely lost their nerve. The psychological terror of the blinding lights, the deafening acoustic roar of the engines, and the sheer terrifying velocity of the massive bearded men swinging heavy steel chains and iron pipes shattered their combat discipline. They realized instantly that this was not a controlled firefight. This was an absolute medieval slaughter. The highly paid private contractors dropped their expensive automatic weapons onto the tarmac. They turned and sprinted desperately toward the darkness of the tree line, abandoning their posts and abandoning their wealthy employers. They scrambled over the broken fences and ran blindly into the freezing wilderness, preferring the mercy of the wild bears over the absolute wrath of the bikers. Gideon squeezed the heavy brakes of his motorcycle and brought his machine into a violent sliding halt right at the base of the massive cargo plane. He kicked the kickstand down and stepped off the machine. His cold steel eyes locked directly onto the Honorable Judge Arthur Sterling. The corrupt judge stood completely frozen in absolute terror. His expensive cashmere coat was violently whipping around his legs in the heavy backdraft of the massive cargo plane engines. He looked completely pathetic and small in the glaring headlights of the surrounding motorcycles. The illusion of his immense political power had completely vanished. Out here in the brutal wilderness, his gavels and his courtrooms and his corrupt legal rulings meant absolutely nothing. Jax and Bear pulled their motorcycles to a halt, blocking the rear escape route of the plane. Sloane Whitaker leapt off the back of a motorcycle before it even completely stopped moving. She completely ignored the men holding the weapons. She sprinted directly toward the 11 freezing children huddled terrified near the landing gear. The children were crying hysterically, their hands covering their small ears to block out the deafening roar of the surrounding motorcycles. Sloane dropped to her knees on the freezing concrete. She pulled a heavy fixed-blade combat knife from the sheath on her belt. She did not look scary or dangerous. Her eyes were completely full of hot pouring tears. She moved rapidly from child to child, using the razor-sharp blade to carefully slice through the thick plastic zip ties binding their small red wrists. She threw her heavy leather jacket over the shivering shoulders of a tiny blonde girl. She gathered as many of the crying children into her arms as she could physically hold. She pressed their small faces into her chest to shield their eyes from the violence that was about to unfold on the tarmac. She whispered to them over and over again that they were completely safe now. She told them the nightmare was over. She told them the angels had finally come to take them home. Judge Sterling took a slow, trembling step backward toward the loading ramp. He raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. He looked at the giant, scarred biker slowly walking toward him, holding a heavy logging chain dripping with blood. He attempted to use his sophisticated legal voice to negotiate his survival. He stammered loudly over the roar of the engines. He told Gideon that there was no need for any further violence. He promised that he had access to offshore bank accounts holding hundreds of millions of untraceable dollars. He swore he could make Gideon the wealthiest man in the entire country. He offered to sign over the entire trafficking network to the motorcycle club and let them control the massive profits. He begged for his miserable life. Gideon Vane did not slow his steady, terrifying advance. He dragged the heavy steel chains slowly across the concrete tarmac, creating a shower of bright orange sparks. He told the corrupt judge that his dirty blood money was absolutely worthless in hell. He told him he was going to personally peel the flesh from his bones and feed him to the wild wolves in the timber. Hollis Thorne realized that his wealthy employer was completely useless and that the giant biker was going to slaughter them both without a single moment of hesitation. Pure, desperate survival instinct flooded his veins. He stepped out from behind the cowering judge. He reached into the waistband of his dirty khakis and wrapped his hand around the cold steel grip of his backup pistol. It was the exact same heavy-caliber semi-automatic handgun he had carefully stashed inside the deep center console of the black utility vehicle 3 days ago. It was his absolute last resort. He ripped the heavy pistol from his waistband. He raised it with both hands and pointed the dark muzzle directly at the broad chest of Gideon Vane. He screamed at the giant biker to stop moving, or he would blow a massive hole directly through his heart. Gideon stopped walking. He stood perfectly still in the harsh glare of the headlights. He looked down the dark barrel of the loaded weapon. He did not blink. He did not show a single microscopic ounce of fear. He simply stared at Hollis with eyes completely empty of mercy. Sloane looked up from the huddled children. She saw the gun pointed directly at the man who was like a father to her. She screamed a warning, but she was too far away to stop the bullet. Hollis Thorne curled his index finger around the curved metal trigger. He stared into the eyes of the giant biker and pulled the trigger with all his remaining strength. A loud, sharp, metallic click echoed across the immediate space. The heavy caliber weapon did not fire. There was no deafening explosion. There was no deadly projectile tearing through the freezing air. The heavy slide of the pistol remained completely locked and jammed. Hollis Thorne looked down at the weapon in his hands in absolute total confusion. He frantically racked the heavy metal slide backward, trying to violently clear the jammed chamber. The slide would not move. It was completely locked solid by a massive obstruction buried deep inside the internal firing mechanism. 3 days ago, while Hollis Thorne was standing outside the rusted gas station bathroom, waiting for the little girl to finish using the toilet, he had left his vehicle completely unattended for exactly 2 minutes. During the agonizing 47 hours, Maya Sterling had spent locked inside that dark rolling cage. She had not just been crying and waiting to die. She had been actively fighting for her survival. When Hollis had forced her to sleep on the thin mattress, she had pretended to swallow the sedative pills. While he drove down the highway, she had quietly picked and pulled at the rusted metal screws holding the heavy metal floor vents in place. She had managed to pry a thick, long rusted iron screw completely free from the metal floorboard. When Hollis had left her alone in the car for 2 minutes to pay the gas station attendant, Maya had seen the heavy black pistol wedged deeply into the open center console. Her real father, David Sterling, was a professional carpenter. He had taught his young daughter to always be incredibly careful around his heavy pneumatic nail guns. He had taught her that if you ever shoved a piece of thick metal down into the firing chamber, the entire internal mechanism would completely shatter and jam, preventing the deadly nails from firing. Little 6-year-old Maya Sterling had taken that thick, heavy, rusted iron screw she pulled from the floorboard. She had shoved it as deep as she physically could, straight down the dark barrel of the backup pistol hidden in the console. She had jammed it violently into the firing chamber, rendering the complex mechanical weapon absolutely, completely useless. Hollis Thorne had never noticed the sabotage. He had grabbed the backup weapon from the console while fleeing the police impound lot and shoved it into his pants without ever checking the dark barrel. He stood on the cold tarmac, frantically pulling the trigger of a completely dead weapon. The realization of his absolute total failure washed over his bruised face. The tiny little girl he had kidnapped and treated like garbage had reached out from the safety of her home and completely disarmed him. Gideon Vane did not give the man another second to think. He dropped the heavy logging chain onto the concrete. He closed the physical distance between them with terrifying, explosive speed. He reached out with his massive, scarred hands and grabbed Hollis Thorne by the collar of his torn shirt. He lifted the adult man completely off his feet, holding him suspended in the freezing air. Gideon leaned his face inches from the terrified eyes of the logistics coordinator. He whispered that his promise to the little girl was finally complete. He threw Hollis violently backward against the heavy steel landing gear of the cargo plane. The sickening sound of breaking bones echoed clearly over the roar of the idling motorcycles. Hollis collapsed onto the freezing concrete, completely broken and unconscious. Judge Arthur Sterling fell to his knees on the tarmac. He clasped his trembling hands together and began to weep uncontrollably, begging the giant biker for his life. He babbled incoherently about his political connections and his legal immunity. Gideon looked down at the weeping, pathetic creature. He realized that simply beating the corrupt judge to death in the dark would be far too easy of an escape for a man who had orchestrated the suffering of thousands. A quick, violent death was a mercy he did not deserve. He deserved to be dragged directly into the blinding light of public justice. He deserved to have his prestigious name and his entire legacy completely destroyed and burned to ashes. Suddenly, the dark sky above the valley was split open by the blinding bright searchlights of 3 massive tactical helicopters. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of the massive rotor blades drowned out the sound of the idling motorcycles. The federal government had finally arrived. Agent Cassidy Miller had not run away and kept her head down. After Gideon had left her at the abandoned drive-in theater, she had made the hardest decision of her entire professional career. She had bypassed her corrupt regional director completely. She had used her secure, encrypted federal credentials to directly contact the highest levels of the Department of Justice in the Capitol. She had transmitted the master client list Sloan had decrypted. She had exposed the entire massive syndicate, including her own boss. The helicopters touched down on the far end of the runway. Dozens of highly trained, uncorrupted federal tactical agents poured out of the side doors, moving with rapid precision. They were not local corrupt deputies. They were the absolute full weight of the federal justice system. Agent Miller walked confidently across the freezing tarmac, holding a heavy black federal warrant signed by a Supreme Court justice. She walked directly past the massive bearded bikers without showing a single ounce of fear. She walked right up to the kneeling, weeping figure of Judge Arthur Sterling. She looked down at the powerful man who had commanded the Dark Empire. She did not raise her voice. She simply pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her tactical vest. She told the honorable judge that his courtroom was officially permanently closed. She locked the heavy steel cuffs tightly around his trembling wrists and dragged him to his feet. Gideon stood completely still, watching the corrupt empire finally collapse into dust. He felt a gentle hand pull softly on the heavy leather of his cut-off vest. He turned around. Sloane Whitaker was standing behind him. Her face was completely covered in dark grease and wet tears. She was holding the hand of the tiny blonde girl she had rescued from the freezing tarmac. The little girl was wrapped warmly in Sloane's heavy leather riding jacket. Sloane looked up into the eyes of the giant man who had taken her in and treated her like his own daughter. Her lower lip was trembling violently. She reached her shaking hand under the collar of her black shirt. She slowly pulled a long, thin silver chain out from beneath her clothing. Dangling heavily from the end of the bright silver chain was a tiny, tarnished silver horse charm. Gideon stopped breathing. His massive heart completely froze inside his chest. He stared at the tiny silver horse charm. It was the exact same piece of cheap jewelry he had bought for Meredith at a small roadside carnival when she was 10 years old. It was the exact same charm she had been wearing the day she was stolen from the street. Sloane looked at the silver horse and then looked directly into the tear-filled eyes of Gideon Vane. She spoke in a voice that was barely above a fragile whisper. She told him that she was exactly 5 years old when the bad men took her from her front yard. She said she was thrown down into a pitch-black, freezing basement. She said she was absolutely terrified and completely alone in the dark. But then she told Gideon that a beautiful teenage girl with dark hair had crawled across the concrete floor and wrapped her arms around her. She said the brave teenage girl had held her tight and sang her a soft song about a wild running horse. Sloane wiped a hot tear from her cheek. She told Gideon that the brave teenage girl had pressed the tiny silver horse charm into her small hand. She said the girl told her to hold onto it incredibly tight and to be extremely brave because her daddy was a giant strong man who was eventually going to come and find them all. Sloane said the bad men came down the stairs a few days later and took the brave teenage girl away forever. She said she had hidden the tiny silver horse charm inside her small shoe for months until the police finally raided the secondary holding house and rescued her. She looked at Gideon and told him she had kept the silver horse charm around her neck every single day of her life for 20 long years. She said she had joined the military cryptography division to learn how to hunt the monsters in the dark. She said she had joined the Black Guardians Motorcycle Club because she was desperately looking for the giant, strong father who had raised the bravest girl in the entire world. Gideon Vane, the massive, terrifying president of the Black Guardians, the hardened combat veteran who had just led an army of outlaws into a brutal war, completely collapsed onto his knees on the freezing concrete. He buried his scarred face into his massive, rough hands and began to openly, violently weep. He cried for his beautiful lost daughter. He cried for the agonizing 20 years of suffocating guilt he had carried on his back. He cried for the absolute pure, tragic beauty of his daughter's incredible sacrifice. She had not died alone in the dark. Her fierce, brave spirit had survived the nightmare. Her spirit had lived on inside the heart of Sloane Whitaker. Her spirit had become the exact technical key that eventually unlocked the digital ledger and brought the entire massive syndicate crashing down to the ground. Sloane dropped to her knees on the cold tarmac right in front of him. She threw her arms completely around his massive, shaking shoulders. She held the giant broken man tightly against her chest, exactly the same way his daughter had held her in the pitch-black basement 20 years ago. She rested her chin on his heavy shoulder and whispered into his ear that he did not have to carry the heavy guilt anymore. She told him that his beautiful daughter had saved her life, and tonight he had finally saved everyone else. She told him he was finally completely free. The dark storm clouds completely covering the valley finally broke apart. The bright, pale light of the full moon spilled down over the granite peaks, bathing the broken fences and the massive cargo plane in a soft silver glow. The war was officially over. The monsters had finally been dragged out of the dark shadows and burned in the blinding light of justice. The children were safe and going home to their warm beds. Time does not stop for grief, and time does not stop for victory. It marches forward like a relentless, steady drumbeat, slowly washing away the sharp, agonizing edges of the past and paving the long road toward a quiet, peaceful future. 12 long years passed over the rugged peaks of the Wyoming mountains. The heavy iron doors of the Iron Sanctuary were propped wide open to let the warm, bright afternoon sunlight spill across the clean hardwood floors. The dark, smoky, dangerous outlaw tavern of the past was completely gone. The massive wooden building had been entirely renovated and transformed into the Meredith Vane Memorial Community Center. The scarred pool tables had been replaced with long, heavy wooden desks covered in school books and bright, colorful art supplies. The dark corners of the bar where violent men used to whisper about crimes were now filled with soft, comfortable couches where local teenagers sat doing their homework after school. Gideon Vane sat quietly in a heavy wooden rocking chair on the wide front porch of the center. He was exactly 70 years old today. His thick hair was completely white, like the fresh snow on the mountain peaks. The heavy, brutal muscles of his massive frame had softened with the Sointian peaceful years. He wore a simple faded flannel shirt instead of his heavy black leather cut-off vest. His deeply scarred face was relaxed, and his cold steel eyes had finally warmed into something completely resembling absolute peace. He held a steaming mug of dark black coffee in his weathered hands. He rocked slowly back and forth, listening to the gentle sound of the wind blowing through the ancient pine trees. He watched the dusty gravel parking lot with a quiet, contented smile on his face. A familiar, deep, heavy mechanical rumble echoed from the winding mountain road. A single black motorcycle pulled slowly into the gravel lot. The rider killed the massive engine and smoothly kicked the heavy steel stand down into the dirt. The rider swung a long leg over the leather seat and stepped off the machine. It was a young woman. She was exactly 18 years old. She was tall and incredibly strong, with a posture that radiated absolute total confidence. She wore dark blue denim jeans and a heavy black leather riding jacket. She pulled a pair of dark aviator sunglasses off her face, revealing deep, intelligent, ancient eyes that had seen the absolute worst of humanity and had chosen to become the blinding light anyway. Maya Sterling walked confidently across the gravel parking lot toward the wooden porch. She had not become a victim, defined entirely by the horrible trauma of her childhood. The 47 hours she had spent locked in the dark, terrifying belly of the black utility vehicle had not broken her spirit. It had forged her spirit into an unbreakable blade of pure, tempered steel. She had spent the last 12 years studying, relentlessly training her physical body and preparing her mind for the long road ahead. She walked up the wooden stairs of the porch and stood in front of the old giant man sitting in the rocking chair. She reached into the inner pocket of her heavy leather jacket. She pulled out a small black leather wallet. She flipped the wallet open with a smooth, practiced flick of her wrist. Pinned securely to the black leather was a heavy, shining gold shield. It was the official badge of an investigative field agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She had graduated at the absolute top of her academy class, completely sponsored and mentored by Deputy Director Cassidy Miller. She held the bright gold badge out for the old man to inspect. She smiled a brilliant, beautiful smile that reached all the way to her deep eyes. Gideon stopped rocking the wooden chair. He reached out with his trembling, weathered hand and gently touched the cool metal of the gold shield. He looked up at the fierce, strong, beautiful young woman standing in front of him. His chest swelled with an absolute, overwhelming pride that words could never adequately describe. He told her she looked exactly like a true warrior. Maya smiled softly. She slowly rolled up the right sleeve of her heavy leather jacket, exposing her forearm to the bright afternoon sunlight. Tattooed deeply into the pale skin of her wrist, directly over her beating pulse, was a small, beautiful piece of dark black ink. It was an incredibly detailed drawing of a pair of mechanical motorcycle wings. Written in elegant, flowing script beneath the dark wings were two simple words: Meredith's Legacy. She looked down at the old man. She told him that she was officially assigned to the Violent Crimes Against Children Task Force based out of the regional capital. She said she was leaving tonight to begin her very first major hunt. She promised him that she was going to spend every single day of her entire life hunting down the monsters in the dark. She swore she would never stop looking for the lost children. Gideon Vane smiled. He reached deep into the pocket of his faded flannel shirt. He pulled out a heavy ring of metal keys attached to a braided leather strap. He held the keys out to the young federal agent. He told her that he was getting entirely too old and too tired to ride the heavy machines anymore. He pointed his weathered finger toward the closed doors of the side garage. He told her his custom-built heavy Harley-Davidson was sitting inside, fueled up and completely ready for a long, hard ride. He told her it was officially hers now. Maya Sterling reached out and took the heavy metal keys from his calloused hand. Her fingers closed tightly around the cold steel. She looked the old giant dead in the eyes. She spoke in a voice that was no longer the desperate, terrified whisper of a fragile, kidnapped child. It was the absolute, firm, undeniable command of a powerful woman, entirely ready to confront the darkness of the world. She told him she was going to make absolutely certain that no child ever had to be afraid of the dark ever again. She told him she was going to find them all. She paused for a long moment, letting the quiet mountain wind blow between them. "Promise, promise," she whispered. Gideon Vane closed his tired eyes and leaned his head back against the solid wood of the rocking chair. He felt the warm, bright sunlight hitting his scarred face. He listened to the heavy, solid footsteps of the young warrior, walking confidently toward the garage to claim her machine. He smiled a deep, true smile. "Promise, promise," he whispered back to the empty air. The incredibly loud, deafening roar of a massive, heavy combustion engine exploded into the quiet afternoon valley. The garage doors swung wide open, and Maya Sterling rode the massive black motorcycle out onto the gravel lot. She did not look back. She rolled the heavy throttle wide open and tore down the winding mountain highway, leaving a cloud of thick white dust in her chain. She rode incredibly fast and incredibly hard, chasing the setting sun directly toward the horizon. She was officially the monster that hunted other monsters now, and the dark, evil predators of the world had absolutely no idea what terrifying vengeance was coming for them in the night. The story of the little girl crying in the dark was completely over. The long, righteous hunt of the winged angel had just begun.